good thing.
I had a couple really bad ones where the sound was just terrible. But should be good. Normally,
Okay.
it's pretty good. I think we're live. Let's see. Media. Make sure I got the settings right.
Is it on your YouTube?
Should
channel?
be, hopefully. Go to my channel.
Oh, there we go.
Is it live on? You see it?
Yeah, I see it on YouTube.
Awesome. Yep, I see it too. Hey guys, how's the sound? Question mark. Yep. All right. It looks like we're live. So Ryan, thanks for coming on and taking the time to have a conversation with me. I really appreciate you taking the time out of your day to come on my channel. Would you mind telling us a little bit about yourself before you get started?
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, thanks for having me. Thanks for inviting me on. When I saw the email, I was very interested. But yeah, luckily I have a lot of free time right now. I'm a high school teacher, and so I'm on summer vacation. So I'm just trying to find ways to fill my summer. I normally do that speaking at summer camps and traveling and doing different things like that. But obviously with coronavirus, everything's canceled. So
Yeah.
I have a lot more free time to ride my bicycle and just kind of hang out at home. And so yeah, I have the time to talk with you this morning. But yeah, like I said, I'm a high school teacher, so maybe a little bit different than a lot of the guests that I've seen that you've interviewed before, which are professors and scientists and philosophers and whatnot. I just teach high school. I've been doing it about 9 years, but about I guess about my 4th year teaching, I started kind of realizing students have a lot of questions and trying to answer the questions and kind of getting a little bit more into Christian apologetics and that sort of thing, and trying to study the science and the philosophy and the theology behind kind of what we believe and why we believe it. And so I teach right now at an international school, and it's mostly non-Christian students from China. And so mostly secular students. And so they have a lot of questions for me. And so what I started doing in my classroom is I started just taking a question of the day, and they would submit all their questions and I would try to answer. And their questions would be ranging everything from the secular worldview to things about Christianity they didn't understand, or just basic life questions or random questions about me. And so I started answering those in my classroom and thought, hey, if I'm already answering these in my classroom, hey, I might as well kind of make it public as well. And so that's when I kind of started my YouTube channel. And so I would just answer the question for them and then set up a camera, record it, answer it again, post it on YouTube. And so that kind of started my ministry or my kind of YouTube channel, so to speak. And so it's just my name. And so I've just been posting videos there. And then more recently, I mean, I had a podcast a while back, but I also just want to make kind of the scholars and the experts, people that you've talked to, kind of accessible to other people. And so I do a lot of interviews on my channel as well. And so bringing scholars and theologians and philosophers and scientists on my channel and interviewing them and allowing my guests to ask them questions. And so that's a little bit about what I do in my job and kind of my free time.
Yeah. What is your YouTube channel so people can find it?
Yeah, just Ryan Pauly, just my name. And yeah, so I just hit 1,000 subscribers. So hey,
awesome! Congratulations, the monetization mark. Yes,
I know. I still need the 4,000 watch hours. I'm almost there, but yeah. So just my name, Ryan Pauly, and so there's a lot of Q&As, short answer videos, short answer kind of videos, 3 to 5 minutes, and those are the questions that generally my high school students have asked me, and so I'm just responding to what they've asked. I keep those short, and that's always a disadvantage because anytime you give a 3-minute response, there's always a lot more you could have said, and objections naturally rise that you just didn't have time to respond to. And then I have about 1 hour long interviews with different people coming up that I've done. And then I also have kind of videos of events that I've done where I do Q&A in front of high school students where I just sit on a stage and answer questions for a while. And so I kind of will chop those up sometimes and put those videos up as well.
Yeah, that sounds like cool. My dad actually teaches at a international high school also in Pennsylvania. So
yeah, it's a really cool experience. It wasn't something I was expecting. I just took the job because I needed to make some money, and then when they started telling me about the school, and because I didn't know anything about it, I just thought, hey, this teaching position is open. They started telling me about the school. I was like, this is really cool. And so it has been a great opportunity not only to learn more about other cultures, but to really be able to get questions from and actually, because I teach a comparative religions and worldviews. I teach a philosophy of ethics, and I teach historical Christian doctrine and apologetics. And so what's fun about that is I'm teaching Christianity and apologetics and and worldviews to students who mostly think I'm crazy and disagree with me. And so it makes the classroom environment a lot more fun. And I actually love it because they push back a lot. And so there's a lot more engagement in the classroom than a bunch of students who are just like, yep, okay, fine, whatever you say, sort of thing.
Yeah, it's really cool. I think that's pretty much how I see most of my teachers. I think they're all crazy throughout almost my academic career. So anyway,
Yeah.
to jump right in, I'm an atheist, by which I mean I believe there are no reasons to believe in the existence of a God. Could you tell me what reasons you believe there are for belief in a God? Then I'd like to tell you my thoughts on those reasons, and I'd like to hear your thoughts on my position.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so I'm going to keep it short, and then I guess you can kind of jump into where you want to kind of focus on. But in short, my kind of one sentence answer is I believe in God because I think that God is the best explanation for the way that things are. And so when I look around myself, when I look at the world around me, I see things that I think that naturalism and atheism and materialism, I think it explains too little about reality. And I think that dualism, kind of taking that worldview approach as a high school teacher, and that's what I teach, taking the worldview approach, I think that dualism explains the world better. And so I think maybe some issues with a naturalistic approach is I think it says very little about what makes life worth living. I think it says very little about why humans want to be free, why society should preserve liberty. I think it explains little about why we find life valuable and why we should protect it. And I think that's a big issue, obviously, with our culture right now and why protect certain lives. And then I think it explains less about human happiness and why the pursuit of happiness is something even that should be considered an inalienable right. And then so I think that there's some issues there where it explains a little bit too little. And then where I think dualism then explains the world better is I think I kind of have 6 thoughts that I kind of thought of as I was preparing for this. But I think that one is that we have a basic awareness of ourself. And I think that's better explained in a dualist view, and then we can talk about that. I think that when it comes to things like free will, morality, responsibility, and punishment, I think that dualism has a better explanation of that. When we talk about the sameness of ourself over time, I think dualism explains that better. I think that dualism explains the possibility of disembodied states and near-death experiences. And then finally, I think that dualism explains better the unity of consciousness that we experience as well. And then one last one is that of how mental states are different than brain states. And so I think that is explained in a dualist worldview better than a naturalistic worldview.
Could you go through those one more time slowly so I can type them out?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that the first one is I think dualism explains the awareness of self, basic awareness of ourselves. I think it better explains the free will, morality, responsibility, and punishment.
Gotcha.
The third one is that the sameness of ourself over time.
Gotcha.
The fourth one is the possibility of disembodied states.
Got it.
Number 5 would be the unity of consciousness.
Is that different than the sameness of the self over time?
Yeah, I can go into that here a little bit. The 6th one there was the mental states are different than brain states.
Okay.
Yeah. So the sameness of self over time, that is simply that I think that when you take physical objects that are composed of parts and you begin to exchange those parts, you begin to get a new or different thing. And so if our bodies are simply physical, as our cells change and over time, then ourselves should also change. However, I think that when we would say, I was born in 1988, I existed then, even though the physical body that I have now, the brain chemicals that I have right now did not exist in 1988. There's something about me that has existed and remained the same over time. If I am still alive, I will exist in 50 years, even though I could lose arms, I could have half my brain removed, that sort of thing. There's still the sameness of myself over time. And I think that dualism explains that better. And then with the unity of consciousness, I feel pain, I feel thirsty. I have, desire to drink my coffee right now, as I see you are doing. And so what is unifying all of these experiences? And so J.P. Moreland, a philosopher of mind, gives the example of, the brain has many parts. And so these parts will assign different states of consciousness to different parts of the brain. There's no kind of totality of consciousness, something that can step back and evaluate everything. So he gave the example of like a football game where you have 50,000 fans, and each fan is looking at a different, piece of the field, and the whole field is covered. And so your brain, like having 50,000 different parts, is all going to be doing something different. You have to have something that can kind of transcend or step outside each individual part and unify those parts into kind of that single consciousness. And so something above the brain that gives us the experience of total unity, where it's I am having the experience of pain, I am having the experience of thirst, I am hungry, that is unifying all of these different brain states that we experience.
Awesome. So great. That's a great introduction to start with. So let's just go with the first thing you said. You mentioned that dualism can explain things better than naturalism. From my perspective, you're right that naturalism doesn't make a lot of claims about meaning and purpose and value. But that's not because it can't. That's because it requires a certain kind of repeatability to it to demonstrate that the claims are actually true. Like in naturalism, we can make up meaning and purpose and value and say it's an undiscovered law of nature or something. There's just no evidence to support that or any other grounds of meaning or purpose. So it seems like naturalism can come up with answers that are equally as good as theism to explain meaning and purpose and value. We just don't, because there isn't a supportable evidence to back that up. Just like we say there isn't for theism. So why would you think that the dualistic answers are more supported than the naturalistic answers we can come up with?
Yeah, so I like to think of it, and I guess as a high school teacher as well, I come up with a lot of illustrations and analogies to try to help things make sense to my students. And so I like to think of it as like a court case where you have a murder that has taken place where John killed Sally, and so you have a defense attorney, you have the prosecutor, and you have the defense as well. And so both attorneys are trying to present, why the client is guilty, why the client is innocent, and so what you're trying to do then is I think that when if a prosecutor has given a series of arguments pointing to why John did in fact kill Sally, and here is 5 or 6 pieces of evidence in support of this, and then the defense attorney says, no, actually John is innocent. I can provide possible explanations as to why he's innocent. Maybe the eyewitnesses were lying. Maybe someone planted the gun. Maybe the video footage of him killing Sally was edited and fabricated. Maybe all these things. I don't have evidence to back those claims up, but these are possible explanations for why John is actually innocent. If the claims that are made are not actually backed by evidence, and then I would say the jury should reasonably rule in favor that John, in fact, is guilty. If there is evidence that supports the claims that he did, in fact, kill Sally, and that is more reasonable than not.
Well, sure. I think I would agree with everything you said there, but the difference, as I see it, would be in the court case, if you present something like John killed Sally using a magic wand and casting a spell, that's immediately going to get thrown out of the courtroom because there's no precedent for magic. So in order for something to be evidence in a testimony court case, there already has to be an empirical basis for the thing that you're claiming happened. You can't just say magic did it or miracles did it or God did it. Those kinds of things are all immediately thrown out of the court case. And in the case of meaning and purpose and value, the same kind of thing applies. If you say, meaning is there or something like that, that is like saying magic is there. Until you can provide an empirical basis to demonstrate that that is actually a thing, then the testimony alone is insufficient to justify the claim, just like saying Mary was killed by a magic wand that cast Avada Kedavra and the green light thing came out. So from my perspective, that explanation isn't any more supported than me just saying, no, there's an undiscovered law of nature and that could explain it too. Those both seem like they're equally unsupported things that we were just asserting. And so it doesn't seem like the dualistic answer is any better than the naturalistic answer in this case.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. But I think that's where in kind of the 6 reasons that I've listed for arguments for dualism, I think that why I like to take the worldview approach is in my view, at least, is that if these 6 reasons stand, and I think that they are convincing, I'm convinced by them, that then you do have precedent for a dualistic or a spiritual, supernatural, at least an immaterial world. And therefore, then you do have precedent where this is now possible.
Oh yeah, absolutely right. So if those other 6 arguments did work, that would qualify as a grounding evidence, background knowledge. So we should start talking about those then. So self-awareness. I think therefore I am. Cogito ergo sum. One of my favorite arguments ever. Why would that be better explained under dualism than materialism?
Yeah, so I think that, in my first point on the basic awareness of self, I think this is also the way I like to think about it is that persons are a kind of thing that's either all or nothing. A person is not does not exist in percentages. And so the body can be divided, the brain can be divided, but our being, who I am, is not divisible. And so I think that then the body and the brain is not capable of or adequate of explaining consciousness, because it is fundamentally different in that way. And so again, where I'd like to think is that if you, kind of like with the laws of logic and the law of identity, right? If you can show an identity relationship between something, you can say that's the same thing, right? Ryan, the YouTuber versus Mr. Pauly, the teacher. If all the characteristics and qualities are equally the same, then you can say reasonably that they're the same person. But if there is a quality that is different, where, you know, Mr. Pauly, the teacher, is 6 foot and Ryan, the YouTuber, is 5'10", well, you now have two different people. Or if at least one characteristic is possibly different, then you have two different people, where Mr. Pauly could have been 6 foot versus, you know, Ryan, the YouTuber, is only 5'10". And so I think that when you look at consciousness and when you look at the physical body, I think that there are fundamental differences. One of which is that consciousness, the self, cannot be divided. I'm not 70% Ryan. I am all of me all the time, versus my body can be divided. And so there has to be, at least there is one fundamental difference between the self and the physical body, meaning the self has to be something different.
That's an interesting perspective. Have you seen the neurological research on damage to the corpus callosum, where your consciousness literally is divided and two separate people can develop in the same brain over courses of time period? It's a paper by Ramachandran.
Yeah, so I haven't seen that exact research, but I know that one aspect, at least from my perspective and the way that I look at it, is that consciousness and your brain are both, or at least your brain is necessary in order for consciousness to function properly. And so I like to think of it, again, in my illustrations for my students, and they're not all perfect, but I think it helps put ideas there. My idea, again, is like a phone and the internet, that the internet is something fundamentally different. The information stored in the cloud is something fundamentally different than my phone, but the phone is absolutely necessary in order to access that information. And so if there is damage to the phone, then you will not be able to access that information properly, or you can get viruses on the phone that skew the information and make it very different. But I think just because there can be things that happen with the brain that may mess up how we access that information or how we view ourselves, I think that still doesn't take away from the fact that the self is something that is different than the physical brain itself, even though they both kind of work together.
Well, that's an interesting perspective, because in the example V.S. Ramachandran uses, in the damage to the corpus callosum, what it causes is two independent personalities to form in the same brain, one of which is a theist who believes in God, and one of which is an atheist who does not believe in a God. So if damage to the brain can cause that kind of a shift to believe in God or to not believe in God, it seems very strange that that's just like a translation error between technological difficulties, like your cell phone example, especially in a theist worldview, because then is one side of your brain going to hell and one side of your brain going to heaven? It's very strange. So it seems neurologically the case that your consciousness is actually divisible. We can physically cause divide in your brain. We can damage it and cause separate parts of your brain to function differently, independently from one another, and develop independent consciousnesses that have different feelings and beliefs and interactions, and completely different people in a brain.
Yeah, but would we say that person, I mean, there's a psychological disorder there, right?
No, it's not like multiple personality disorder where it's just a different kind of a mental state. It's literally the two sides of the brain aren't talking to one another, and so they develop independently. So it's literally just two brains in one head.
Yeah, so I'd have to look into that study a little bit more. Again, I think that where my mind is going, obviously not having looked deeply into what the study that you're talking about is the idea that we can have viruses that infect physical things that cause a skewed perception of reality. And I think the Christian worldview does explain this, granted that it's true, that, that we are fundamentally broken, that we do have things that are affecting the broken natures of us and the world around us. And so there are going to be disorders, there are going to be skewed perceptions of reality. Luckily, I'm not the judge of that. So I'm not saying that half a brain goes to heaven and half a brain goes to hell. God ultimately understands what is happening there and the issue that is going on that is causing this. But I still think that there's that one aspect.
So if hypothetically we could neurologically show that consciousness can be divided, would that be a defeater for your argument that it's indivisible?
I mean, yeah, that if that could be shown, then yeah, I think that the first point I have here of the indivisibility of the self would be defeated. And so we'd have to say, okay, is there any good reason to believe that that will or could happen? And again, I think the kind of the position that I'm taking is trying to kind of like, again, in a courtroom of what do we know right now? And we kind of have to make a decision of what I believe based on what we know right now. And so, if the prosecutor or the defense attorney says, well, if I could show this, then is it my person would be innocent? Yes. But have you shown that? No. Okay, well, we can't just sit around and keep waiting. We kind of have to make a decision. And hey, if in the future we realize we're wrong, we'll change the outcome, right? We'll change the verdict. We'll free the person. But right now, everything sure is pointing that they're guilty. And so we're going to go with that.
Do you think it's reasonable to take the word of the vast majority of the experts in the field of cognitive science and neuroscience that it can be divisible? Is that a reasonable evidence to take?
Well, I think that you have to look at, I really think that there's the worldview right behind it. And so if the cognitive scientists are taking from a materialistic, naturalistic worldview, that the consciousness and the mind and the brain is simply a physical thing, therefore we can divide aspects of the brain and therefore divide aspects of the consciousness, then I would say that we're starting with one issue. And so that's where, again, this is 1 point of 6, but where I would say, hold on, let's take a step back and ask the question, is consciousness even an aspect of the brain, or are they fundamentally different? Where in my view, consciousness would be more like the cloud and your brain is more like your phone. And even though what we experience doing tests on the phone seems like something is messed up, there's still something fundamentally different that we're dealing with.
Oh yeah, I would totally agree that just if someone started with a worldview like naturalism and just used that as a presupposition in their position, and that wouldn't be good evidence. But from my position, the way it works is that the people in the field make novel testable predictions about if the brain is purely physical, then we make these predictions and then do these results and get this experiment result, and that's tested and confirmed. That seems like it's good evidence towards that theory, even if it's not proof. And that seems to be why they conclude that consciousness is physical, because they can make testable predictions, whereas the dualist position hasn't been able to do so. And that seems like a good reason to lean towards the materialistic worldview from my perspective.
Yeah, well, so I think that what you said is if we can prove the brain is physical, then we can make these predictions. And I would say, yes, I think that's true that the brain is physical.
Well,
I think
not
there's
exactly,
still...
just to clarify. So I'm saying that in science, the way it is you start with a hypothesis, you just make up an idea in your head and say, this is my belief, this is what I believe. And then you say, if my belief is true, I can make a testable prediction and say, I can do this result and I can do this experiment and I'll get this result if it's true, if my position is true. And in neuroscience and cognitive science, that's what we see is like they start with the position, the brain is physical. If the brain and mind are both physical, then we can expect to see these kinds of results if we do these experiments. Like, for example, I'll bring up the free will thing in the next one, but we can expect to see certain results, and we get the results that we expect to see if it's purely physical. And that seems to be a good indicative evidence that it is purely physical.
Yeah. So I'd be curious then, because so my 6th point that I guess I made is that mental states are different than brain states. And so I guess I'd be curious to what your position is on kind of the points in why I think that actually the mental states are different.
Sure. What are those?
One being that mental states do not fail to have crucial features like spatial extension, location, being composed of parts as physical states are. So you can weigh your brain. You can't weigh your thoughts. The thought of my mom washing the dishes at the sink, it does not have weight or spatial location versus the brain state does have those kind of spatial locations.
Well, let me just address that one real quick. It actually does. It does have a specific weight, which is the electrical and biochemical activity in the brain, which composites the idea itself. So it does have a weight, but it's not like a finite weight because the amount of things that you're thinking about change from second to second. So if you add in colors, it has more weight, or if you take features away, it has less weight, and the level of cognitive ability increases. It's just the level of energy in the brain is just equals MC squared, basically. You can measure the mass and energy of those thoughts. If you could accurately measure the brain, you could do those things.
So again, that would be measuring the correlated brain activity to the thought, but that's not actually measuring the thought itself.
Well, again, from the position that I've outlined, that literally is the thought. The thought literally is just the brain activity. And
And so that's that. Again, I think that again, I think that if I'm having a thought on my mom, that the actual thought itself cannot be weighed. You can weigh the chemicals that that are correlated to it. So yeah, when you think of something in your brain and you look at someone's brain through the machine, you can see different parts of their brain light up, and you can weigh those aspects. But the actual thought that they're having, and again, why another reason I think it's slightly different is because the mental states are private, they're inner, they're immediate to the subject having them, and so. We cannot connect a machine to someone's brain and know what they're thinking, right? So we can see the chemicals firing, we can see parts of their brain lighting up, but then when they come out of the machine, and we have to say, well, what were you thinking about, right? And so there's this disconnect of we can see these things, and but we have no way of reading them. The thought itself, what the person was actually thinking about, is something private and inner to them.
well, not actually the case. Recently, we've done fMRI studies where we've been able to look at the brain, look at the activity, and know what a person is going to choose before they know they're going to choose it. So we can see, I think we're up to like 7 to 11 seconds ahead where we can know what they're going to choose before they know they're going to choose something just by looking
Yeah,
at
but
the brain
that's
states.
Yeah, but so that's a little bit different than what I'm talking about, though. Is again, so we can see something firing in the brain that seems like they're going to choose something, but that's different than if you say, okay, Ryan, have a thought, think about something from your childhood, and so I start thinking about something from my childhood. You can see my brain activity firing, right? But you will not know what I'm thinking about, because that brain activity is not, you can publicly access the chemicals that are firing, but you cannot publicly access what I'm actually thinking about.
Well, actually, that would be the same thing. The point of the analogy was that if we know the orientation of your brain state, we can actually know exactly what you're thinking just by looking at your brain state. The reason we can't know that initially or right now is because the way your brain develops, it's neuroplastic. It develops based on your inputs randomly. So it's kind of like how language developed. If we just jump into a society 5,000 years ago, we wouldn't know what they're saying. But if we followed them from the point of when sounds started to like originate, where they're like grunting, like "Arr, arr, arr," and that meant like horse or whatever, then we could trace their entire linguistic tree to know exactly what they mean by every single word. And the brain's the same way. If we could go back to your childhood and watch your brain form and watch your sense experience of that you're having, like I saw fire or whatever, and then that neuron in the brain lit up to associate with fire, then we could actually just look at your brain state and know exactly what you're thinking just as a reference to your sense experience. We wouldn't need direct awareness of your conscious experience because we could just map it just by looking at your past experience and seeing how it mapped onto the brain.
Yeah, so I think that this is again based on knowledge that maybe you're acquiring beforehand. But if you hooked me up to a machine, and again you just said, I want you to think about a choice. So if you said pick the right, as far as the studies that I've kind of heard of what you're explaining is the difference between push the right button or the left button sort of thing, and then we can see brain activity light up of what their choice is before they realize they've thought of that choice. But if you instead said something like, I just want you to think of a choice of what you're going to eat for lunch today. You'll see something light up in my brain, but you won't think if I was thinking of eating chicken or beef or steak or stew or whatever. There's information there that you cannot access. And I guess the prediction that I'm making is that I don't think that we will ever be able to access that information because there's something fundamentally different. So that would obviously be something that we have to wait and see, I guess, the predictions of how science goes. Where I'm open to is, hey, let's keep searching. Let's keep trying to figure that out. I just think that that is something that is true right now, that we cannot access that information. We can set up experience again where you put thoughts in my mind and then you can see things light up. But if you just said, hey, think of a story from your childhood, and I started thinking about an event that happened, there's no machine that you could hook up to tell me what that thought exactly is. And I don't think that there ever will be. And so to me, as of what we know right now, I would say that there's something fundamentally different where that thought is private.
But do you think that if we could watch your developing formative years and see how your brain developed neuron by neuron and the things that associated with that, we could do that with the machine potentially? Do you think that's a possibility?
I think that there are ways to read information, and there are ways that maybe one day we could be able to somehow map something. I still think, though, that there's something fundamentally different. And again, this is getting way beyond my area of expertise. I'm not a philosopher, but I've done very minimal study in things like types and tokens, right? So you have a physical representation of information, but that information is still something different. And so even if we could, which I don't know if we could, but even if we could somehow map the brain to be able to kind of create that map of starting to piece pieces together as we see different things that people think about. I think there's still points to there's something different about the physical representation of it, and then the information that it is representing.
Oh yeah, absolutely. The type token distinction is a really interesting one, but again, that would fall back into my linguistics example. Is that the natural ambiguity of language? All words are completely arbitrary. They could mean infinitely many things, whatever we want them to mean. But the finite association comes from a sense experience where we see like a horse or whatever, and we make a noise, and then that noise becomes associated with the horse. There isn't an intrinsic connection between the type and token of that noise and that thing it's identifying. It's purely arbitrary. It just happened by chance that sound happens to be identified with the horse because that's the sound the person made. And so just by listening to the sound, we'd never know it was associated with a horse. We'd have to actually see the point at which the sense experience was associated with the sound. And that's where the type token distinction comes in, is that because there's an arbitrary association between the sound and the object, we can never know that the sound means the particular thing in the object. Just like when we look at a particular neuron lighting up, we can never know just by looking at the neuron that it's associated with a particular object in the same way. But if we could see the original sense experience where the association was made, we could actually overcome the type token distinction in that case.
Yeah. So again, I this is not, again, my area of expertise, and I feel like I'm kind of pointing that out being too much, but I think the difference is that I would be curious to actually see where the research does go into actually mapping out the brain in the way that you're saying is possible. I think that there is not a one-to-one correlation in that sense, but even if so, that there's still this kind of difference in distinction to where, again, the prediction that I'm making is that as our neuroscience advances, I don't think that we will ever be able to read a person's mind and know their thoughts. And so again, I think that is based on what we now know about neuroscience. It is not possible. We can sit there and say, well, maybe one day we will be able to map out this ability. But again, I'm making I'm founding my beliefs that I have now on what we do know now, not what might be possible some point in the future.
Yeah, I mean, I still lean with the consensus. Like, what do the experts in the field tend to think? And I think
but the experts in the field are going to say that thoughts themselves are private, that we cannot read a person's mind. That if you said, Ryan, think about your childhood, they're not going to be able to hook up a machine and be able to tell me exactly the event that I'm thinking about.
Well, actually, no, the experts would disagree with you there. They'd say the same thing I just did, that just like in words, the neurological association is arbitrary. So we can't know just by looking at the neurological association. But if we can look into your past and see how the neurological association formed to sense experience, then we will be able to identify what exactly it is you're thinking. That's essentially the consensus in the field.
That's the prediction, right?
Yes, it's a conclusion based off of the predictions we've been able to make successfully so far.
Okay, so that's why I guess I would step back to the courtroom example and say, here's what we know is true based on the evidence that we have at this current moment. And then, the other person comes and says, well, here's a prediction that based on some things we do know that there's some sort of connection, and therefore we should be able to do this. And me, the jury, and I go, well, but we haven't done that yet. And so I can't rule that this person is innocent based on what could possibly happen in the future. Based on some things we know, I have to make my decision based on what I do know now. And what I know now is that there's something different about the thoughts that we have.
Well, isn't that how science works? Is that we start with a hypothesis, we make predictions, those predictions are confirmed, and then based off those confirmations, we make more predictions down the line. And if the past predictions have been pretty successful, it's reasonable to infer that those future predictions are also going to be pretty successful. That's like how general relativity, Newtonian mechanics, how every scientific theory seems to work. Evolution, I don't know what your position is on evolution, but that seems how every scientific theory works. So if the past predictions have made successes consistently in lots of fields all over the world that everyone can confirm, then it seems reasonable to infer it's going to continue to do so, don't you think?
Well, it's reasonable in one sense of that we should continue to pursue it. I think that we absolutely continue to go after it because it's like, hey, we've been able to do X, Y, and Z, so let's try this one as well. However, I think that what the topic of our conversation here is that we're trying to figure out now, based on this evidence, what is it that we and your listeners actually believe? What are the decisions that we are actually going to make right now in the current moment that does affect us? And so again, I think that's where the courtroom example is good in the sense that if you have John who possibly killed Sally, and you go, well, Mike and Smith and Aaron and Steve all killed other people, and we accurately predicted those. Therefore, it's most likely true that John also is a murderer. That's not going to work, right? We have to take each case by case on an individual basis. And so that's where I say, look, let's continue to do science, right? Science is making those predictions. Let's continue to push. Let's advance. I'm all in favor. I want there to be more Christians in science, not less. It's not something that Christians should shy away from, which is sadly the case in many aspects, is that Christians don't want any part of science. I think that's a huge mistake. But when now we're supposed to then say, now what do I believe? What decisions am I going to make right now in the moment? I think that is where we somewhat step away. This might sound bad, but step away from the scientific method in the sense of saying, this is only a prediction. I'm super interested and curious to see if this is true, and let's pursue it and put everything we can into figuring out. And maybe I'm wrong, but I make my current present day decision based on what we know now. And I think, again, if we didn't make any decisions in our lives until we figured out all possible explanations, we would never decide anything, right? No one would ever go to prison. So I think that's where there's a slight difference. And yes, that's what science does. And I encourage that and I pursue that. But right now we have to make present day decisions on what do I believe about God? What do I believe about the nature of the soul? And right now I'm going to do that on the evidence that we do have. And so, yeah.
Well, I'm still a little confused on your position there, because from my position, it seems like if we see evidence that the sun has been rising every day for the past however many years, and we predict that the sun's going to rise tomorrow, and we get it right, and predict it's going to rise next week, and we get it right, then it seems reasonable to predict it's going to continue to rise like 1,000 years from now. And that's essentially what the scientific predictions are doing. Like, we can make these extremely precise predictions about what's going on neurologically in the brain based off of the hypothesis of naturalism. We've been able to do that for many, many years. Everywhere in the world, people are doing this. They're making these fantastic discoveries about how the brain works. It seems like that pattern is kind of like saying, well, we've been able to accurately predict the sun's going to rise every day for the past X number of years. So it seems reasonable to infer we're going to continue to be able to do that. So it seems like, based off of the current evidence we have today, the most reasonable conclusion is the one I outlined, that we're probably going to be able to look at the brain and see what's going on if we could actually follow your formative years.
Yeah. Where I think I see a slight difference, though, is that the rising of the sun is the same event. Right. And so predicting that the sun is going to rise tomorrow, you're predicting that same event, versus the predictions that we're making in neuroscience and all of science. We're making now new predictions based off of information that we have. And so it's not simply predicting the exact same thing over and over, like this plant's going to use photosynthesis. Whoa, it did it. And this plant's going to use photosynthesis. Whoa, it did it. We're actually taking information that we have learned and confirmed, and we're now making a brand new prediction about something that is totally different in a different way. And so it's not, I don't think the sun example relates there. It's making new predictions.
What do you mean different way? Because from my perspective, again, the evidence is all it's the same thing. We're taking the neurological data, saying this data correlates to this thing, and we're going to be able to predict what's going to happen in the brain based off just looking at the brain states. And it's essentially those kinds of predictions of saying the brain is physical, the neurology is the thoughts, and using that as an assumption, we can make these predictions. And those are the things that we're getting right consistently, like the examples of knowing what people are going to choose before they choose it 7 seconds ahead. Those would be the more interesting examples, but there's millions of these kinds of things in neuroscience. So it seems like it's the same thing. We're saying the brain is physical, neurology and thoughts are the same thing. And we keep making progress along those lines, just like the sun rising. And so assuming that the entire brain is just physical and all of the brain is just neurological, just seems to be more of the same thing, just like the sun rising. Would you disagree?
Yeah. I would in a little bit, in the sense that I think that there's a difference between giving someone an option and then seeing a brain activity and knowing what they think they're going to choose, versus again, not kind of feeding that information in and saying, tell me about your childhood. What color, like, hey, what color is my shirt is my mom wearing right now in my mind? that is information that we don't have access to. And so I think that is a different type of experiment. That's a different type of prediction, that we will be able to access the color of shirt that my mom is wearing in my thought, versus pick the button right or left, and then I can see a brain activity saying which one that you're going to pick.
It was because there's a similar experiment is where we take an electrode, we put it in your brain, we can simulate a certain part of your brain and know what color you're seeing or what sound you're hearing, or we know there's a specific neurons that are associated with faces, and we damage those neurons, you can't recognize faces. And we've mapped out lots of parts of the brain where we can just say this part of the brain in pretty much every human does this thing, and if we damage it, they can't do this thing anymore. And so it seems like using the assumption in the past tense rather than making future predictions about choosing a button right or left, we can actually say this part of your brain does this, this neuron does this in general, and just zap it and say, okay, you can't do that anymore. Physically impossible because your brain doesn't have the capability. But it seems like we are able to make those kinds of predictions pretty regularly about how the brain works and how neurons correlate to thought experience. And if you damage a certain thing, you can't have the thoughts anymore, or you lose the memory, or you lose the associated faces, et cetera, et cetera. Wouldn't that still fit in the same kind of a thing as the sun rising? So it's pretty reasonable to infer it's going to continue to rise.
Well, again, I think that what you've described is does show the connection and the correlation between the physical states of the brain and the mental states in the mind. But again, I think that these are different, and there's other reasons again why I think that they're different. And so it's not just me saying, well, I think it's different, therefore it is. So I think that this would be one example of it, that there's something fundamentally different about the color of a shirt my mom is wearing, based on other examples as well. And so there's other reasons why I think that these are two different things that you can, if you damage the brain, like I said before, you will have difficulty accessing that information. Just like you damage a phone, you can't access the internet or the cloud. And so, but to say, therefore, the phone is the cloud, that is a leap that is not grounded, I would say. And so I think there's other philosophical and even some empirical things, like I said, kind of near-death experiences that I think go on to further, I guess, my belief in why I think that these are different.
Sure, let's go to the next point. It was free will and morality. So why do you think free will and morality is better explained by dualism than materialism?
Yeah, so I watched a few of your videos, and so what I think, if you still hold to the position that you don't believe in free will, is that correct?
Yes, I think free will is impossible.
Okay, impossible. Yeah, so I think that we know that we have free will. And I don't think that that's just a trick. I don't think that's just that we are determined to think that we have free will. I think that we know that we do, and that there are things that we could have refrained from doing. So again, I would define kind of free to will as just having the choice to choose between two or more options, that each of which is consistent with our nature. So obviously, I don't have the choice to fly. That's not a part of the human nature. But am I going to eat chicken or beef or something like that? That's kind of, we have the ability to refrain from what we're doing that. And this is why humans are responsible. This is why when we, a person goes and advocates for the poor, the hurting, we praise them. I think that this creates human responsibility. I think this is what our society is grounded on, especially now with all the issues that are happening in our culture, with all the protests and whatnot, is that there's an understanding of human responsibility, of how we should and should not act, that we make choices that are incorrect, and then we punish people for those incorrect choices. And so I think that having purely material objects, they do not have that free will. They don't have that consciousness, as you even said, it's impossible.
Well, so I think they have consciousness, just not free will.
Okay, so yeah, and we can talk about that here in a little bit. But okay, so I think I would say that purely material things don't have consciousness, but sticking with the free will, I think that a purely material thing does not have free will. As you've said, it's impossible for that thing to have free will. And so I think that then removes the foundation of what we understand is true of reality, of what we expect of human responsibility. At the same time, I think that then it also makes it difficult. And I know you've talked about this in quite a few of your other videos. I think there's maybe an illustration I would like to get your thoughts on that wasn't discussed, but I think that would be making truth propositions impossible to know as well. So
is that the one you wanted me to hear my thoughts on?
Well, yeah, I mean, so anyway, so that's why I would say that the dualism, having a free will and being able to make choices that we are then responsible for, I think then would explain things better. So why I think that this is difficult is that if you have a purely material object, as you've described, that then it's impossible to have free will. Then I think then that as I've discussed, I think that takes away from everything that we understand about our society of personal responsibility and punishment. But also, then when we make statements like atheism and naturalism is a better explanation, then those words are simply just a programmed aspect of our determined state. And so it's, I guess the illustration that I've thought of is that if you have, and now probably Alexa's probably going to go off right now when I say her name, but when you have Alexa and Siri, which are two programmed, whatever you want to, AIs, and you could program them to think that they're real people, but we understand that they're not programmed. They're determined. They do everything by their programming. And so if you program Alexa to say that 2 + 2 is 5, and you program Siri to say 2 + 2 is 4, and then you put an Alexa and a Siri in a room, they will never be able to figure out which one has accurate programming, which one has been determined to produce true and accurate results. In order to know which one is accurate, you have to be able to step outside of their determined states to be able to freely evaluate based on evidence which one is true. And I think that if our evaluations are something, again, just that are determined on our programming, it becomes I think it becomes impossible to know what is actually true if our programming is more accurate than another.
All right, so if Alexa and Siri are in a room and one says 2 + 2 = 4 and one says 2 + 2 = 5, and they have 5 objects there, and they take 2 of them and they put them next to the other 2 of them and realize, oh, there's one left over. Don't you think that would realize one's right and one's wrong?
But they would have to be aware and to be able to freely evaluate and look at these objects that they have. And so again, that's where it gets into, well, that gets into kind of your point of, you do believe that there's consciousness. And so I know that and I'm not saying you hold to this, but I know people like Daniel Dennett or others would say that consciousness is an illusion because physical things are not conscious. And so in the same way, I would say Siri and Alexa are not conscious. They're purely physical objects that are programmed to do what they do. And so therefore they do not have the ability to take 4 objects, put them next to each other and figure out that 2 + 2 = 4.
Well, I would definitely disagree with that because we know that biology can do math. We know that bacteria and different kind of living organisms can figure out the correct path and the incorrect path and figure out what's the shortest route between different food systems or whatever. So we can definitely take just physical things with no consciousness, and they can figure out which is the correct path. Even rocks know the correct path of the shortest distance from falling down a cliff or whatever. Electricity always gets the shortest distance between 2 points because of just physics. And so we know that biology can actually do math. It can actually calculate and can figure things out and problem solve and do all those things just by physical associations of mathematics and logic or whatever, based on the real world, just associations to reality.
So I'm going to make sure I want to not mess you up. So I'm writing down what you said. So rocks know things?
Rocks can figure out the correct path without knowing things.
What are rocks using to figure things out?
They are correlation to the world. They're interacting with reality.
So a rock does interact in the sense that it rolls around and it's subject to gravity, but that's very different than figuring something out. That there's thinking involved.
Yeah,
normally,
that's just a figure of speech. So, for example, bacteria can do math. It can figure out if 2 + 2 = 4, 2 + 2 = 5, just based off of its interactions in the world. It doesn't need to know anything to be able to figure out math. So Alexa and Siri could figure out which one is right or wrong, even without consciousness.
Well, Alexa and Siri will just tell you what they've been programmed to tell you. So if I program Alexa right now to say 2 + 2 is 5, and I say, Alexa, what's 2 + 2? She'll say 5. She has no idea that answer that she just gave is incorrect.
Right, but if she is programmed to interact with the world and test her position against reality, then she can figure out which beliefs are correct, which beliefs are incorrect.
So you'd have to do more programming, but if that programming was flawed, she would have no way of, if she's actually testing that accurately.
Right, so you'd have to have some kind of a foundation to know the programming works in some sense. For example, I think therefore I am, which is how
exactly.
ours does.
Yeah, so that's where I would take that step back and say, without that foundation, without that stepping outside of the programming to know that the programming is functioning correctly, then we can't actually know the programming is functioning correctly.
Well, we don't need to step outside of it because we can know one fact just within the programming necessarily is true. Like, I think therefore I am. It can't be false. So even just being programmed, whatever way you want to program me, that belief can't be false in any way you program me. You can never program me and make that belief false, no matter what. So I still have that foundation even from within the programming that I exist and that statement is true.
Okay, but that wouldn't apply to all programming, right?
Right. It would just apply to the foundations of math and logic, which is what you need.
Okay, well, yeah. So I think that's I think that's a slight stretch, in the sense that just because you could be programmed. So again, I could program Alexa to think that she exists, and I go, Alexa, do you exist? Well, I think, therefore I am. But she's just been programmed to say that. She's not actually thinking that.
Right.
And so she still is not stepping outside to you could program her to say, no, I don't exist. And so she thinks that she actually doesn't exist. And that's what she's saying. And again, she, without having to be able to, without the ability to step outside and evaluate the claims that she's making, she will not know if that claim is actually true. We are outside of Alexa. So we recognize that if Alexa says, I don't exist, we know that's false, but she doesn't know that that's false.
Right. So there would need to be a part of the programming that can be retroactive and see the test the things that it's saying against reality. That would be the point. And we have that. And it's purely material. You don't need a non-material thing. Like we have chess computers that can play against each other and win and learn chess, or AIs that can play video games and learn how to beat video games better than any human being just by purely internal means. You don't need the external means to be correct about things. You may need the external means to be absolutely certain you're correct about things, but you don't need that for knowledge. You don't need absolute certainty.
So I think that's a great point. But I think that points to the fact that we have programmed these chess computers to do certain things, and we are evaluating and realizing that then we have now given it this ability. Versus if you take two computers in a room, program them separately, and then leave the computers then by themselves without human interaction, those computers will not be able to figure out which one is done correctly and which one is incorrect. Because if you program that computer to actually say that the goals of chess are to lose your king rather than win your king, it will figure out the best way to lose the king. It's going to have a wrong teleological end goal of what is the purpose of chess, and never know that is the wrong purpose. And it's going to think it wins every single time by losing its king. And the other one is going to say, man, I'm taking the king every time I win. And neither one is going to actually know which one is truly winning at chess.
Right. If the goals are arbitrary, like playing a chess game, that's the case. But if the goal isn't arbitrary, like it's necessarily the case that I exist and I believe I exist, then you can't get that wrong. You can't be programmed to be incorrect about that. It's not even possible to, because the
So I don't understand why not, because you could be programmed to say you don't exist, and that would be a wrong statement.
Right. So you can't have a belief you don't exist and be right. That's the point.
Correct.
So that fact on its own,
you could genuinely believe it and be, I guess what I'm saying is you could genuinely believe it. You could be determined to say it, but it would be a false statement.
Right. The fact that we can know it's a false statement is the key here, is that the belief part is irrelevant. It's the fact that we can know it's wrong because we have the independent system of logic that we can apply to assess it's right and wrong, which again is purely internal, but that's all we need. We don't need anything else.
So I think that's where I'm trying to make the point of that. I think that independent evaluation ability is better explained in dualism, that has an independent reality that can evaluate the physical, versus where I'm trying to make the point of a purely naturalistic process would be like putting Siri and Alexa in a room and say, or two chess computers in a room and saying, figure out which one is better. Without that independent ability that is separate and distinct from the physical state, I don't think that that's possible.
Why would your worldview not have the same problem? Like, for example, if we assume we're non-physical or dualism beings and we want to say that the logic of dualism is true, then you would still have the same problem. We're still Alexa and Siri, we're just non-physical Alexas and Siris. And so why do we believe that way our brains work is correct any more than the physical way our brains work is correct?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that because in the Christian worldview that we are created free, and so I have the ability now to make free will choices, and we are created also as rational beings with the ability to evaluate evidence and compare and contrast different points. And so we're not Alexas and Siris in a room that are simply just immaterial Alexas and Siris, but we now have a free will that gives us the ability to now weigh different options and make choices.
So why can't I just say the same thing under naturalism and say there's just a free will super law that gives us freedom to be able to do that? And how is that not equally as supported as the theistic claim?
Do you have any evidence that there is a free will naturalistic law, that somehow naturalism can produce free will? Because you yourself said naturalism, free will is impossible.
I would say I would have exactly the same amount of evidence as theism does.
I don't see how that. So what's your evidence for it?
Well, I would take every one of your arguments and I can mirror them and make them for naturalistic pantheism, which is just eternal, all-powerful nature or whatever. So you can say if freedom is a part of the nature of God's nature, I can just say there's a law of nature, which is pure freedom, which is a part of naturalistic pantheism or whatever. Yeah. You can mirror all of the evidence for theism or any other ultimate theory of everything, like polytheism, pantheism, naturalistic pantheism, which is just a kind of naturalism, transtheism, henotheism, panentheism, they all work equally as well. That's why I think there's no real evidence for God, because all of the arguments, none of them actually can differentiate imagination from reality, which is my definition of evidence. So it seems like anyone can make the assertion that there is this free thing without actually defining the free thing. Because one of the biggest problems I see with the theistic position is you say there is this free will stuff, but there's no actual definition of what it is. Because if you say any decision, any action that can take place, a choice between A and B, either there's going to be reasons you choose one or the other, in which case your choice is determined by those reasons, or there's going to be no reason you chose one and it's going to be random by definition. If there's no reason you do something, it's by definition a random action. And those are the only two options. There isn't a third option there to escape the determinism or random dichotomy. So anything you do, even if it's physical or non-physical, is either going to be determined or random. And just asserting that there is this third option, well, I can just do the same thing under naturalism.
Yeah. So I've kind of I watched, like I said, quite a few of your interviews where you go into naturalistic pantheism and say that everything that all the arguments for God's existence can equally be explained by that. I think I've thought of a couple that can't, and these have briefly come up in some of your other conversations, and I think also just for the sake of your audience listening, to kind of rehash a lot of the same stuff you talked about with a lot of other people sometimes might get boring. I don't know, but I think that. I think that there are at least a few different examples that would show that that the naturalistic pantheism can't account for the same examples in or arguments for God's existence. And one would be the idea of near-death experiences. I don't think that a naturalistic explanation can account for what we see there. I think when it comes to arguments for God's existence, I think that the idea of naturalistic pantheism being the cause of the universe, I think the major problem there, and this has briefly come up in some of your conversations, is the idea of the first cause needing to be personal. And naturalistic pantheism does not have a personal conscious cause. And so I think that does create an issue for a finite beginning of our universe. And then lastly, I think in your interview with Greg Gansel, you talked about the idea of morality and having objective obligations. And I think that naturalistic pantheism cannot provide objective obligations, which is what we see coming from the moral argument for God's existence. And so I do think that there are some aspects of that, and we can obviously go into those, and I know you have responses, but to where I would say, no, there are some things that are fundamentally different. And so I know you use the 2-pound box example of, saying it's a rabbit and it could be a lizard, it could be something else. And I think this is a great example because, and I love the illustration, mainly because I like illustrations, but I think it's also a great illustration because if you're pointing out that all evidence for God is like a 2-pound box where it could be anything, it's not just a rabbit, but it can't be anything. It can't be anything that weighs 1 pound, and it can't be anything that weighs 3+ pounds. So if you have a 2-pound box, it's not a house, it's not a car, it's not an elephant. So there are a lot of things actually with that example that are ruled out by the definition or by the characteristics of the box weighing 2 pounds. And so I think that there are certain characteristics that we do see that by definition then rule out other things as being at least possibilities. And so I think that if you do have a personal cause, which I think is necessary in order to have a finite universe, and then if you have a objective moral obligations being another, and near-death experiences, then you can, or at least the moral obligations and beginning of the universe point to, I think, a personal agent. And I think that near-death experiences and the arguments for dualism make that agent, as we talked about at the very beginning, at least a possibility. And so you can't rule out that possibility. And so I think those would be different to where you say, look, it's definitely not a car because it only weighs 2 pounds. Therefore, you could say it's not something natural because it has to be something personal and conscious.
Well, the interesting thing about the 2 pounds is that it could definitely be a car, house, or an elephant because all those things do weigh 2 pounds if you move them far enough away from the source of gravity. If you put them in space, they'll weigh about 2 pounds. So you can actually have the 2 pounds be almost anything. But in the case of the arguments you presented, morality, the consensus of the experts in the field of philosophy, most are atheists. I think it's 70-something% are atheists. and 56% are moral realists, but only 15% or something are theists. So the vast majority are atheists, but still believe in objective morality and moral oughtness. One of the things being like Platonic objects. Platonic objects are a potential alternative grounds of objective morality that's accepted by philosophers as being a possibility, and usually preferred to theistic God grounds of kinds of things. And so it seems like a non-conscious thing can ground morality no problem. There's many different various theories of morality that entail that.
Yeah.
And that again, I would say that's the consensus in philosophy. And in the consensus in physics is that there is no personal requirement for the beginning of the universe. Is purely quantum mechanical. That's the like significant vast majority, 99.999 something huge massive percentage of physics. It's all physics. There's no, the personal argument just doesn't really fit in the physics at all. It's a philosophical thing. So in cosmology, it's not really an accepted argument that you needs to be personal for any reason at all. And in NDEs, the consists again in neurology and cognitive sciences that those are purely explained by physical processes, certain kinds of delusions, hallucinations. There's nothing about those that can't be explained physically. There's no real evidence for those. They definitely happen. There's definitely NDEs that occur, but there's nothing about them that require a supernatural explanation, as far as I can tell. And there's great evidence that they're probably not, because the things people see when they have NDEs can completely vary based off of their personal past experience. Like if you have an NDE in India, you see an Indian god. If you have an NDE in the Muslim countries, you see Muhammad. If you have an NDE in Christian countries, you see Jesus. If you have an NDE as a child, you see Santa Claus. So those things don't really seem to be indicative of something outside of the brain, because your brain isn't dead. It's still functioning. The NDE isn't like you're dead and then you have an experience. It's more just your brain stops functioning for a little while, and then the chemical processes in the brain are still going on. You're just not conscious because it's not a flowing electrical system. And those things can cause neurological changes, which then affect your memory. And when you wake up, when everything restarts, it has an effect on your memory as it's trying to process the changes in your brain. It creates these memories, and that's essentially the naturalistic explanation of NDEs. So it seems like in all of those three examples, I like the consensus. I'm obsessed with the consensus. The consensus of the experts seems to reject those as reasonable hypotheses. So they're possible, absolutely. You can't, I don't want to say I can just rule out a God in any way except maybe logical contradictions. But I don't think those are supported by the evidence in the field, like using your courtroom example. Based off of the evidence we have now and the experts and consensus in each of those fields, it seems like the evidence goes the other way.
Yeah, no, I think those are great points. And man, there's so much to say on all three of those, so I don't know exactly where you want to start. But I guess we got time, right?
Yeah, go wherever you want. I'll let you decide.
So again, that's why I love I love teaching worldview, because I really do believe that we recognize that human beings have worldviews. That we are biased, right? And then maybe a lot of listeners are like, oh, here's just the biased Christian, and yeah, it's true. I am biased towards Christianity, but I think that in our value,
I'm totally biased towards naturalism. We all have biases.
Yeah, exactly. Wonderful. Yeah, we all have biases. And so hopefully what we're doing and what we're trying to do in this conversation is we're trying to recognize what our bias is, remove that bias, and do the best that we possibly can to evaluate the evidence. And so one thing I would recognize, and I think that you would also agree, is that just because the consensus says something doesn't mean it's necessarily true. Now, if you're going to go against the consensus, you better have a very good reason as to why you disagree. And so I think I have reasons as to why I think the consensus is missing something, and I think it's a worldview issue. And so that's why I don't always agree with the consensus. There's a lot of times I do, but I like to look at the worldview kind of implications as to, is there a reason why maybe we're leaning in a certain direction? So I guess maybe I'll start with the beginning of the universe, because I think it's a little bit shorter. I would like to share a few things on NDEs that I found your conversation with. I don't know how to say his last name. Is it Tissacharis?
Yeah, Alex Sarkiris.
Sakiris. I was way off. Anyways, I found that fascinating, and I have some thoughts on that I would like to again kind of share and get your response to. Right, that's why we're here. But so when it comes to the beginning of the universe, I think Alex O'Connor, the cosmic skeptic, and William Lane Craig. I don't know if you saw their conversation they had. I think it was last week or 2 weeks ago. If you watch that, I thought Alex O'Connor asked the question of, why does the Kalam cosmological argument lead to a personal cause? And I thought William Lane Craig's response to that was very reasonable, in the sense that how do you get an effect with a beginning with a cause that is permanent, right? If the cause is truly sufficient for the effect, then the cause is there permanently. The effect ought to be there permanently as well. And so how do you get a permanent cause with an effect that only has a finite, with an effect with only a finite time ago? So if you have this permanent causal thing, the quantum fluctuations, and these quantum fluctuations have been happening eternally, and these quantum fluctuations are sufficient for the effect of creating a universe, then how do you only get the universe a finite amount of time ago if the cause has existed eternally?
Yeah, it's actually really easy. 47. So how did I pick 47? Like there's infinitely many numbers before 47 and infinitely many numbers after 47, but I picked 47. If you have a system that's outside of the number graph, there's just like me, I'm not actually in these numbers, infinite, negative infinite to positive infinite. I'm not there. So I can just pick a number at random and just say 47. And so this number I've picked is a finite number out of an infinite series that could exist. In quantum mechanics, it's the same thing. You have these interactions that happen outside of space-time. They're not a part of space-time. And so they can just pick a number like 47 and begin the universe there. And so there's these interactions in quantum mechanics that don't need time. And so having a finite time isn't really a problem in quantum mechanics because it picked a number. It just said here, just like I picked 47.
Yeah. So I think we got cut short a little bit, maybe because this goes back to our previous conversation on free will. And so I think what that you were able to do, and I think that the solution to this is that because I believe that you have free will, a free will agent, it's only a personal agent that has free will that has the ability to initiate new effects without any antecedent determining conditions. So if you instead change it to where it's not an agent like you picking a number, because I think that again, I think our conversation got cut short. We kind of got on a rabbit trail. But if you have, for example, like a freezer, the freezer is always set at 0 degrees Fahrenheit. The water, therefore, in the freezer will always be frozen. If the water goes from frozen to not frozen, then you know that there has been a change. But if the cause is eternal and the cause of a temperature of 0 degrees Fahrenheit has no free will to be able to pick something, then the effect should also be eternal with it. And so if you have a quantum vacuum that is not conscious, has no free will, or gravity or something like this, I think that gravity does not make choices. Gravity can't pick a number at one time versus pick a different number at a different time. Gravity just always does what gravity does. And so therefore you should have the same effect at all times where things are always pulled down. The only time that you're going to have a difference is if gravity has actually changed.
Well, that would only work on the A theory of time. So for example, if you have all of a time like in one box and you have something outside of time, which is just the way it is eternally, and the way it is causes the universe to begin at 47 seconds or whatever, then the universe is only going to have one beginning at 47 seconds, even if that particle is eternally just determined to pick 47. But a further point would be is that the quantum particles aren't determined to pick 47. They're random. They have a essential randomness to them, so they can do anything consciousness can do. Anything that consciousness can pick can be reflected or also done by non-conscious states of just quantum mechanics. Anything consciousness can do, quantum mechanics can also do, picking random numbers, for example. So one thing is quantum mechanics there's an infinite amount of options for a particle to collapse, and it collapses at one. It's not a choice in the literal sense, but it's an analogous to a choice where you just pick one out of an infinite spectrum. And the same thing can be true of quantum mechanics, either randomly or determined, and you can get that finite beginning at 47 either way.
Okay, but so wouldn't you say though that if these random fluctuations or changes are happening within quantum mechanics, and these random changes are happening for an infinite amount of time, then our universe should have created an infinite amount of time ago?
Well, no. So I'm saying these happen outside of time. So they're not happening for an infinite amount of time. These interactions happen outside of time. They sand time, to use William Lane Craig's term. And so if it's outside of time, even if it's just determined to be outside of time and pick 47, then it's still only ever going to pick 47. 47 is going to be the only thing it ever picks. Then the universe still only begins at 47.
But it should have picked 47 50 billion years ago versus like, you know what I'm saying? Like
it's outside of time. So the 47 is the only point it can pick. It doesn't exist in time.
So we have a timeless physical thing that is making changes. That would put it inside of time, wouldn't it?
No, again, so in quantum mechanics, current theory is space-time is an emergent of more natural fundamental properties that exist outside of space-time. For example, Neymark, Kunighmann's amplitude-hedron, Sean Carroll's emergent space-time. The current consensus is that space-time is not the most fundamental natural thing. There is more fundamental natural stuff below that.
So there's more nature behind nature.
Yeah. And it's outside of time. So there's no time there. So it doesn't like happen for an infinite amount of time and then choose 47. Time is just like a single line on a graph, and it just points its finger at one number outside of the graph and picks this number. So it can do that either determinedly or randomly, and it's still, the universe is still going to only begin at 47.
Yeah, so I know that this is something that, at least in your conversations, it shows that you've done a lot more research on the theories of time than I have. But I just don't see how the way that we measure time, right? You have to have a completely different kind of view of time to have another physical thing that is outside maybe our time, but is somehow not having a time of itself. And so what is the beginning of that time? And so ultimately you somehow have to come back to a beginning. And at least my understanding of this is that if you have an effect or a cause that is sufficient for the effect, and that cause has happened for an infinite amount of time, then you should have an infinite beginning or infinite effect as well. And so again, we seem to be attributing, at least how I understand it, we seem to be attributing personal agency in a sense to physical stuff in order to get them to be able to do things that physical things simply don't just do. Just like I said, the freezer that is always frozen, you will always have frozen water. You will never have a time in which the water went from not frozen to frozen if it has always been freezing.
Well, in my understanding, physics is only allowed to use verified principles, particles, and laws in physics. So they're not adding any personal qualities to it. It's just math. And the reason it doesn't have space-time is because they take space-time is the lambda signal in physics, represented by general and special relativities, like Einstein stuff. And if you remove that from the equations, you're left over with not space-time, something that is not space-time. And that's essentially what they're doing. They remove space-time completely from the equation. So there isn't any space-time in it, or not another kind of time at all. It's just a timeless, spaceless kind of interaction. Yeah. And so there wouldn't be...
I think that's it. Sorry.
Well, go ahead.
I just say, and I think that's it. I mean, that's obviously where like the cosmological argument goes in pointing to how physics is pointing to this timeless, spaceless thing, and what can exist outside of space and outside of time. Well, if you're saying it's more space and more time, well, then that's not timeless, spaceless. And so where God being described in Scripture as a timeless, spaceless being, that makes sense.
Right. So I'm saying there's not more space or time. That part is removed from the equations. There is none of that.
That's why God would be defined as someone who is timeless and spaceless, because there is no space or time.
Oh, right. And that's just in physics. There's just none of the added stuff. There's no consciousness, all powerful, all knowing, all loving, personal, any of that stuff. It's all just combinations of verified principles, particles, and laws in physics. And that's why I think the physics theories are more reasonable to believe, because they are purely just grounded on things we already have verified access to, even though it's just a novel combination. So like, to use your court case example, like what caused that hoof print in the snow? Like it could be a horse. And since we already have examples of horses, that's a reasonable conclusion. Or it could be a unicorn, but so we don't have any examples of unicorns, probably we should go with the horse. And that's why I think the physics explanations are preferable in this instance of what caused the Big Bang.
Yeah. And so, so maybe I'm misunderstanding your point, is that the physics are still pointing to something spaceless, timeless. And that's not a physics question, because now you're stepping outside of the realm of physics into something philosophical and theological, but it still is what physics seems to be pointing to. Is that what you're saying?
No, I'm saying that it is a physics question. I'm saying that,
okay,
because everything they're using, every part of their equations is a representation of a thing, a physical thing of some kind of physical interaction in the universe. So they're only allowed to use those things to build models of the universe. They can't add anything else. They're not allowed to. So their models of a spaceless, timeless interaction is only using different kinds of math that we've seen observed in the universe. So I wouldn't say, the one thing I would disagree with what you said is that it's not a physical thing. It's still physics. They're still only doing physics when they're saying these things. And the question is what caused the beginning of the universe? Is it more reasonable to believe that this cause was a combination of stuff we've already seen and have evidence for that can explain interactions without space-time? Or is it this new kind of thing we haven't seen evidence for, like the unicorn? That's my argument, is that we should go with the horse, not the unicorn.
Yeah, no, and that makes sense on why we want to go in that way. And that's why, again, I think I take the step back and I go, okay, here are a wide range of of reasons to believe that dualism, which we've kind of stepped away from, and that's okay. But here's why I think the dualism actually makes sense, to where now you now have good reason to believe in a unicorn. And now we have to say, well, does the unicorn or does the horse make more sense? If we kind of rule out dualism, if we rule out an immaterial world and say everything has to be something physical, well, then obviously that gets ruled out by definition.
And so and we should never do that. No, as far as I know, no scientists do that. Methodological naturalists do not ever do that. We never rule things out. That's not fair. We can't do that. Totally unreasonable. We should never do that.
Well, in a sense, yeah. So, but scientists do it in the sense of saying, well, we have to find a physical explanation for this, because the moment you insert God, it's God of the gaps. Like you're inserting something in, you can't do that. There must be some physical, natural explanation for this.
I wouldn't agree with that. So again, the way I see science working is that you're only allowed to use combinations of things we've already have verified. So you're not allowed to just insert something we haven't verified and say, what knocked over that cup? A leprechaun did it. Like clearly,
exactly,
no.
Yeah.
Well, you can use that as a hypothesis and say a leprechaun did it, and if a leprechaun did it, I'm going to make these predictions, and if these predictions are confirmed, then we have evidence of leprechauns. That totally works. So science doesn't rule out the supernatural. It just says that in order to use the supernatural as an explanation, you have to put it through the same criterion we do for every new hypothetical particle or every new discovery. You have to say, I'm assuming this new thing is true. I have no evidence for it yet, so I'm going to make a testable prediction. And if I can confirm that, then we have evidence. But until then, it's just a hypothesis. So God works as a hypothesis in science, saying God could explain the origin of the universe. But until it can be verified and actually demonstrated to be able to make testable predictions, we can't use it as a confirmed hypothesis. Whereas physics, all the physics is just confirmed hypotheses. They're unconfirmed, and they can add nothing else to them. They just have to combine them in new ways.
Yeah.
So that would be one thing.
Your video just got a little blurry.
So the one thing I just disagree with very fervently is the fact that the scientists don't exclude the supernatural. They only use the natural stuff because that's the stuff we have confirmed. They're only allowed to use the stuff we have confirmed.
No, that makes sense. No, and I guess maybe what I'm going for is, or at least what I was referring to, was sometimes the more internet atheist. The moment you insert God, you are doing a science stopper, because that stops our inquiry of science, and so you can't say, well, the moment you say God did it, now I don't have to try to search how the universe started anymore. It's like, and so that's often what you hear online. And so I guess that's what I was referring to, where hopefully we say, no, let's continue to search. Let's try to find that naturalistic explanation for how this kind of took place.
Oh yeah,
I'm not the
agree
Christian in the position that says, well, God did everything and therefore we don't have to figure it out. I think that I remember being at a conference, and a lady was like, hey, can you recommend a book that explains how my neighbor believes that the moon was created because of events with the earth or something like that. And I want to refute this and just say God created it. I'm like, you don't have to. Like, we have good reason to believe that's how the moon was formed, but that doesn't take away from God being a creator at all. So like, I'm not that kind of Christian that's like, no, let's do more science, as I said earlier. So I guess, again, that's where what I think that it has come down to in a lot of the conversations that I've watched of yours is that if we simply focus on a physics example or some sort of biological or scientific example, it's easy to say, well, what about the God hypothesis? Do we have any good reason to believe it? And that's why I started by stepping back and saying, let's kind of challenge that idea from the beginning of dualism and whether that makes sense. And so, again, I think if you grant that as a real possibility, the explanatory power of dualism and of God, it far outweighs, I think, the naturalistic explanations, being that, again, I'm convinced, at least, I don't know how convincing I am, persuasive, but I'm convinced at least of the idea that an eternal freezer is always going to have eternal frozen solid water. You're not going to have a gas. You're not going to have liquid. And so to have a time when the water went from liquid to frozen to solid shows that there has been a change that has been made. But if you have an eternally frozen state, you're not going to have that change. And so for us to have a finite past to our universe, you cannot have an eternal cause unless you have one that has personal agency that can then choose to make changes.
Right. And I want to mention that I do totally agree with you about the internet atheist thing. We can't just say that inserting God is just immediately wrong. But no, you can't do that. You can't rule out God or the supernatural just by definition. It's completely illogical to do that. You just have to hold the same standard you do for, you're only allowed to use things that have been verified through novel testable predictions as explanations. Anything more than just a hypothesis. If supernatural, perfectly fine to have a hypothesis. You can definitely have evidence for those things. Like if I pray to God for a gold brick and a gold brick appears in front of me every time, like 10 times in a row, great evidence of God, totally possible. Not a problem there. But yeah,
there could be a naturalistic explanation for it.
It could be, but if I make the testable prediction, I say that I believe in a God. If God is real, I make a prayer for a gold brick, and a gold brick appears. That's evidence for a God and not for the natural explanation. So
Okay.
even if you could have other explanations, the testable predictions of everything kind of a thing.
Yeah.
So you wanted to go to NDEs. You said you mentioned those.
Yeah, I did mention those. Where I think, I guess where I'll just start and just jump right in. Where I think the naturalistic explanation falls short is the idea that that these are merely hallucinations, or that they are chemicals that are taking place in the brain that affect the memory to make you think you remember something that you simply don't. And so and why I think that these are different is because, when I talk about NDEs, it's not like, oh, I went to heaven and I saw Jesus, and there's no way to confirm that, right? I want to look at the evidential, kind of the peer-reviewed evidential cases that are in literature that we can then test. And so things like, for example, there's one account that a woman was in the hospital. She had the NDE while in surgery. She had an out-of-body experience where she kind of ascended above her body, and while there, she saw the medical devices in the operating room with a 12-digit number on top of one of the devices. I don't know if you've heard this example before, but she saw a 12-digit number, the serial number, on top of one of these medical devices. And this device is about 6 to 8 feet high. It was above all the heads of the people that you needed like a ladder to get up on top to see. So as soon as she was revived, woke up from surgery, she said to the nurse, "Hey, get a piece of paper and a pen. I'm OCD. I just had this weird experience where I memorized the serial number on top of that machine." And she began to recite the 12-digit number to the nurse, and the nurse wrote down that 12-digit number. A couple days later, they were making some changes to the room. They got up on a ladder, they checked, and the number matched perfectly. And so I talked to Gary Habermas was one who originally told me this story. And he had graduate students actually go down to the hospital and found the nurses and the doctors in that room and interviewed them to get their kind of perspective on the story as well. So this would be one example. There are others. There's another one where the person has an NDE, out-of-body experience, and went up into the rafters of the hospital and saw a quarter dated 1982. And when they woke up, they said, "I had this weird out-of-body experience where I saw a quarter up in the rafters dated 1982. They went up in the rafters and they found that quarter." And so I think that these would be experiences that it's not just simply, I can remember going down a slide. Well, of course, you've gone down slides before, you remember that. But these are actually testable claims about an external reality that they should not have had information of prior to. So I think that would be, at least in my mind, that is a good reason to believe that these are not simply just hallucinations, because they're lining up with reality. And to get to hallucinate a 12-digit serial number on a medical device that then matches reality perfectly, that's, again, I think it takes more faith to believe that's a hallucination than something actually happened there.
Okay, but why would that be just not like a random chance event? Like, from the reason we need novel testable predictions is because there are strange things happen all the time that we can't explain in reality. They're all everywhere. But the fact that we can't explain something isn't evidence of therefore supernatural. So in order for it to be evidence of the supernatural, you'd have to say, I believe in the supernatural, I'm going to make this testable prediction, do an experiment, get a result, in order to verify that it actually was the supernatural, not just a strange event we can't explain. So why are we taking these strange events we can't explain and then saying therefore supernatural?
So it's not just a strange event, I would say, that we can't explain, is that we do have a perfect explanation for it. That if we take a naturalistic bias, I think that we rule out that explanation. So if you have a maybe I'll explain in a way that makes more sense of how I just put it. But if you have a person who is brain dead, heart dead, having a true NDE in that sense, so there's no brain activity, no heart activity, and then they have an experience out of body that actually lines up with reality, that's testable, then there's a good reason to believe there that that there is something that actually took place outside of their body. Now, can I prove that 100%? No, I can't prove it. But again, I think that we're not trying to prove things beyond all doubt or even beyond all reasonable doubt. I think that it's kind of like the preponderance of the evidence. I think that there's more reason to believe that something actually did take place than didn't, because again, these are tested things. And again, it's not just one or two of these events There are many of these. 30 million people have claimed to have NDEs, but there's more than 300 of these cases in literature. So you have, I think it was Bruce Grayson who has published over 100 of these in medical and psych journals. And so you have documented cases of no brain activity, NDE, where then the person has an experience that's not just something that they remember that could be some memory affected, but actually a verifiable event where they're finding corners and rafters and serial numbers on machines that if you're going to say they got lucky, to me, I don't have enough faith to believe that. I think the better explanation is that if you don't rule out the immaterial world, that is good evidence for it.
Right. So, but my critique is not that we should definitely not rule out the supernatural. That's not my claim, is that there are unknown things that happen all the time. Why are we concluding that this unknown thing is supernatural? Because you can always make up an explanation. There's always infinitely many ways to explain anything. You could just say it's an undiscovered law. You could say, there's a soul. You could say there's a God told them. You could say aliens came and just beamed this into their head. There's infinitely many ways to explain everything, which is why in order for an explanation to be considered a good explanation, you have to say that I have this explanation, I'm going to make this testable prediction, then confirm the testable prediction. Just the fact that you can post hoc explain an unknown, anyone can do that about anything. That's why every scientist has their own pet theory to explain everything. But in order to make one accepted, you have to be able to make that future testable prediction kind of a thing. Just the fact that you could explain this by saying it was a out-of-body experience, that actually the soul left the body and could still see things somehow, that isn't actually evidence, just the fact that you could explain it. You need to go further than that and be able to make testable predictions.
So I'd be curious on this, so kind of going back to the courtroom case, I'd be curious what your thought here is, because I don't think that necessarily a testable prediction is required for evidence, in the sense that if John killed Sally, we can make a testable prediction as if you shoot someone in the head, what will happen? Well, you'll die. But we can't make necessarily a repeatable testable prediction on the exact event of John killing Sally. That is an event that is that happened, and we now have to come to a conclusion based on what best explains the evidence. And so we say, based on the fact that we have a gun and we have these 4 eyewitnesses that also saw this happen, even though we can't repeat the exact event, this is a one-time event, it's a forensic science rather than a repeatable science, we can come to the conclusion that the best explanation is that John killed Sally.
Yeah, so my position is that all forensic science is repeatable science. Like if I said I saw a dog, like you can't obviously repeat that one experiment of the dog I saw, but dogs, we have lots of empirical repeatable evidence of dogs. We have lots of empirical evidence of people seeing dogs. So every feature of that claim, the testimony claim, is supported by repeatable testable evidence, even if that particular claim wasn't supported by empirical evidence. So it's reasonable to believe someone if they say that I saw a dog, because every feature of that claim is empirically verified. There's a dog, there's people, you see stuff, totally fine. But if I said I saw a unicorn, that wouldn't be evidence for unicorns, because there isn't any pre-existing empirical data of unicorns. It's the same thing with the physics. The reason physicists are only allowed to use things that have already been verified, because you can always insert whatever variables you want to make it work and just say, I have this new variable and it can explain the data, and then therefore evidence. So the fact that you need testable predictions is like an entry level. You need to have some testable predictions to have the class of things be counted as verifiable. So if I said I saw a dog, perfectly reasonable without empirical evidence, because there's past empirical evidence of dogs existing. But if I said unicorn, not so much.
Yeah. And so that's where I guess your box analogy, I think, would come into play here, of that you could definitely rule out what it's not. Right. So if again, with a box, if what box weighs 2 pounds, you can definitely say it's not a car. In the same way that if you have a person who has no brain activity, has a verifiable, testable experience out of body while they are dead, so to speak, while they're having this near death, they're having the NDE, you can definitely say it's not their brain.
Well, that part I would disagree with.
Well, so how would their brain be having a verifiable experience of a serial number when there is no brain activity? It's not just a memory that they're pulling up, like you said before. It's not a hallucination. This is actually a real physical event or a physical thing that exists in the real world that they had no knowledge of.
Well, I have to look at those specific cases, but I can use the other cases I'm aware of, for example, where patients describe something the doctor said or whatever in the operating room where they were under anesthesia or brain dead. The sense experience, even though they're brain dead and their electrical activity is below the EEG level, their senses are still functioning. Their brain isn't completely inactive. There are still chemical interactions going on. And so when someone says something, the sound waves still go into the ear and still activates the correct center of the brain, which creates a memory. It's saved as a conscious memory because your brain's shut off unexpectedly. And so when they wake up, that conscious memory is then recollected as it being something they experienced when it was just a imagined thing that the brain collected through the sense experience and then put it together when it was reawakened. So those are the kinds of things that most NDEs are explained as just, well, it was the sense experience as their brain was still being processing things, just not at a conscious level. And then the consciousness then put those pieces together and it was saved as a conscious memory. The same thing can be true for serial numbers. I know that there are many cases of serial numbers where that was the case, where someone said, here is a serial number for some reason. They're just reading it off on a list, and the person recalled the serial number because it was said by a janitor in the hallway near them or by a nurse, or they said something about their life, and that's how near-death experiences can be explained purely by physical things. I'd have to look at the specific cases that you mentioned because I don't know those off the top of my head.
Yeah. So again, that's where I would say, look, even if 99% of cases can be explained by the kind of inside the room where the person, the doctor is talking and they are somehow aware of it, even though they are supposed to be brain dead at that moment, you still have to, even if some are more clear cut, you still have to deal with the difficult ones, right? And to where I think the more difficult ones, I think the more persuasive ones are out of the room experiences, where someone is not in the same room. Again, where there's a quarter on the rafters, where there's a shoe on the top of the hospital, where there is, another one was, what was actually said in the waiting room with the family that was waiting in the waiting room and what they were actually talking about, and a joke that someone said, or what the family was eating for dinner at their house while the person is having an NDE at the hospital during a surgery. And so I think there are enough of the out of the room experiences that cannot, or it is more reasonable to believe that something actually did take place than to put it on there's some sort of memory or things like that. So I think trying to explain away the more difficult by using the more clear cut, I don't think that we can do that.
Well, all the ones you listed, except the first two, are things that can be purely naturalistically explained. Like the ones about the dinner table, that's just family habits. You can probably guess, I've guessed 10 meals that a family has. It's going to be one of those 10 meals.
And that's my objection to that one as well. And so I'm on the same boat as you, is dude, I'm super skeptical of a lot of things. And I think that's what's driven me into apologetics, is that I'm a very skeptical person. And my students are actually very surprised to hear me say that when most Christians say they experienced a miracle, I don't believe them. And so I'm very skeptical in that sense. And so my first objection was to the dinner one of, well, I mean, I eat pizza every Sunday night. So if you're having surgery on Sunday night, you can be like, oh, my family's eating pizza. Well, then you're going to be that's a good guess there. I just think that there's enough of these, like the first two, to me, that are more persuasive, to where this is a medical device that I don't know of any janitors reading off serial numbers for medical devices in the hallways that someone is somehow going to hear while they're having an NDE. And so again, I think that this is the idea that are there possible naturalistic explanations for these? Absolutely. But to where I'm trying to make the decision for myself is what makes most sense based on what I know. And again, just because there's a possible explanation for something, and again, going back to the court case, the defense attorney is going to have something to say against everything the prosecutor says, right? The defense attorney is good. They are going to have another explanation, and they're going to have an answer for everything the prosecutor says. And this is where it comes down to the jury, to your listeners, to whoever's watching this video, to say, okay, it's not just because someone has a possible explanation doesn't mean that this theory has been debunked. We still have to evaluate this. And so to me, where we now have to then base our understanding, and we both agree that we don't know everything. And so we're basing our knowledge not on 100% certainty, but what makes the most sense. To me, I find it very persuasive that if you're brain dead, if your brain has ceased function, there's no measurable brain activity, yet someone is having a memory experience that is now verifiable outside of themselves and even outside of the room, like the serial number example. I think that is good evidence to believe something actually did take place. And now, could there be a naturalistic explanation? Sure, but what is it? And I think that it's more of a stretch. I think it takes more faith to believe that than to say, yeah, this points to the fact that our memory, our mind, our soul is different, distinct from the body, and that our soul actually can exist outside the body.
All right, absolutely. I think we definitely need to assess which explanation is more plausible. We can never know for certain. We should never ever try to rule anything out unless it's like a square circle. We can rule out square circles. It was not done by a square circle. But
absolutely,
from my position, I think that if we try to say what's more likely, that there is an immaterial soul that can still see things when it leaves the body without eyes, which we have no evidence for, this completely new.
But you just ruled out the evidence. We do have evidence, is that the fact that people have seen things when their eyes, when they're disconnected from their bodies, when their bodies are dead. That's the NDE.
I mean, like, so without this, like, we're trying to explain this event. We have this experience. People have experiences of things outside of their body, but outside of that event, we have no evidence of this happening. We have no evidence of being able to go outside of your body and see things, as far as I can tell.
Yeah, so, outside of the evidence that we have, it's like, I mean, maybe this is a little bit of a stretch, and so please correct me if I'm making too much of a stretch. But it seems like we're saying if you don't count all the evidence for this, then you have no evidence for it. If you outside of everything, so it's like saying if you go outside of all murder cases, we have no evidence of murder cases. Well, yeah, because you just went outside of all murder cases.
Right. So it's like if we're trying to explain
guns, if you don't count all the people that have been shot with guns.
Right. So it's like if we're trying to explain electricity or lightning, if we see lightning and we say, well, if we don't count all the lightning cases, well, then we have to say, well, what's causing this? So like if I say, well, there's lots of evidence of Zeus, let's look at all the lightning. But okay. So wait a minute. So we're trying to explain the lightning here. You can't just use the lightning as evidence of Zeus. We first need to. That's the thing we're trying to explain. You can't use the thing we're trying to explain as evidence of your explanation. That's circular. So yeah. In science, that's why you have to have a separate explanation. You have to say, I believe this thing exists. Here is a separate prediction I can make that can explain the data. I can't just say, this explains the data. I have to say there's a separate prediction here. That's why you can't just use your explanation of the phenomenon or use the phenomenon as evidence of your explanation of the phenomenon. That's why you can't just use NDEs as evidence of the supernatural. You need some other criterion to indicate that the souls exist. And then say, here's this independent evidence we have of the souls existing, and then so we can conclude that this could also explain NDEs or something like that. That's how scientific works.
Absolutely. So completely agree. And that's where I started with 6 reasons to believe that there is a soul in a dualistic world. And so again, it seems like what we're doing is that when we talk about number 1 of awareness of self, and that their self is indivisible, the body is divisible, that there's something different about who I am than the body because there's different characteristics. It can be divided and it can't. And to say, well, what other evidence do you have? Because you can't just use this one to support yourself. And I said, well, the other evidence is NDEs, that we have verified experiences in literature that say that when someone has no measurable brain activity, they are having experiences outside of their body where they continue to see things, even though their body has no brain activity. And it's verifiable external things that they should not be able to see. And it says, well, is there anything else? You can't just use that one. Well, yeah, we also have free will and morality and a sense of responsibility that makes sense of our experience in the world. We also have, our unity of consciousness, that we have something that is unifying all of the different thoughts into a singular, I am experiencing these things. And then that also, then I think is supported by the distinction that I tried to make at the beginning with mental states and brain states. And so I think what seems to be happening is that we are dividing each one of these and saying individually, each one on its own doesn't stand. You have to have something external to this to support it. And that's where I go, yeah, I have 5 other reasons. But when we go to the next one, it's saying, well, this one doesn't stand on its own. You need something external. And it's like, yeah, well, that's why I also have 5 other evidences. And so like in the courtroom, you can pick apart why you think the gun doesn't make sense. But when you have the gun and the fingerprint and the eyewitnesses and the video and all these things, you can try to show holes in each one. But when you put all 5 or 6 pieces of evidence together, dang, John sure looks guilty.
Yeah. So from my perspective, it seems like each one of the examples you've presented can be explained 90% better by naturalism. The experts in the field all conclude this is natural in each of those examples: morality, beginning of the universe, free will's not a thing, consensus in physics, except for compatibilism. Most people reject libertarian free will in physics. So it seems like all of the evidence and all of the experts in all of the field conclude that this is vast majority more likely to be natural explanations. And so each of those cases, could you understand from my perspective, since each of those cases are better explained by naturalism by a significant degree from the expert's perspective, that those would not qualify as a cumulative case for the supernatural. And so each case you're presenting, I'm addressing individually, because so far the other cases you presented haven't added up to anything from the perspective of someone who sees these as being more supported by the naturalist explanation. That's why I'm treating
Yeah.
it as individually.
No, I completely understand it, and I see what you're trying to do here. I think that just because this is what the consensus says, we have to take a step back and actually evaluate what the evidence itself is showing us. And I think that what I've at least tried to do, whether I've been persuasive or not, that's up to the listeners to decide. But what I've tried to do is at least show where I think the consensus is maybe missing a point, or where the consensus is allowing a worldview to impact how they actually see these things. And so when you take a step back, I think that there are good reasons for this. Now we kind of we left morality for the last one, but again, I think with near-death experiences where you say that 99% better explained by naturalism, I still don't understand how naturalism better explains the serial number example, for example.
I definitely, I can't comment on those because I haven't seen them. I have no idea what they are. I can explain all
Yeah.
the other ones pretty well because I've looked at them, but the ones
So
I haven't looked at, like, I don't know. I don't know yet.
Yeah, so I'd be curious. Maybe we can have a follow-up or something. I don't know, on my
Sure.
channel or something. But so I'd be curious because, again, it seems like what I've tried to say before is that we're taking the easy to explain things, and then saying, therefore, we can also explain the difficult, or there is a naturalistic way that we haven't discovered yet that we will. Whereas I'm trying to make the point of, no, we have these difficult things that naturalism doesn't better explain. That there is no naturalistic explanation for how this woman was able to memorize a 12-digit serial number from the top of an operating machine while she is currently having no measurable brain activity. For that to happen, you either have to appeal to conspiracy, that she is lying, that somehow the nurses and doctors are lying. You have to appeal to somehow this woman snuck into the operating room, got on a ladder, memorized the serial number, then went out and got herself in a car accident to where she almost died, happened to get rushed into this exact operating room, to then have an NDE while on the table just so she could wake up again and say, I memorized the serial number. And so I think that when you try to find what are the natural explanations for her being able to have a verifiable out-of-body experience while having no measurable brain activity, I don't think that there is any naturalistic explanation for that. And so if we're going to say, well, maybe one day we'll find one, awesome, let's look for it. But right now, the evidence is saying that's not possible. It's not likely. It's not reasonable. A better explanation is she had an experience outside of her body, which means that she must be able to disconnect from her body. That seems just like the logical conclusion, rather than saying we're now inserting something that we have no evidence for.
Right. I mean, I totally agree with you that you shouldn't just, since I haven't looked at the evidence here, I can't really comment on these.
Yeah, fair enough.
But I can definitely make up better naturalistic explanations. Like, for example, there could be a technician who has to look at the inspect all the different equipment, and they have the serial number as a way to identify, did I inspect the correct one? Here's the paper I have to write out. He actually did it. He actually said it in reading off the things, and that could be one way, just to come off one off the top of my head. So there are definitely better natural explanations than she like slipped into the hospital at night and then looked at the serial number and then got the. So, but yeah, I don't want to comment on those because you're right. We shouldn't presume there's a natural explanation. We should look at the evidence and then assess. And so I'm gonna have to look at those cases individually before I try to comment on what those are.
That's fair enough. Yeah. So again, so that would be one thing that's persuaded me, and we can discuss that more later if you so desire. So again, that's where I would say, just kind of, I guess, reiterate kind of my points is that those are the examples that have persuaded me that there is something that actually is here happening. And so when I take that, combine it with the other things that I either experienced or that I think also are kind of confirmed, that again, that would be one reason why, going back to our neuroscience examples of where I think that there is something different with the mind than the physical brain. They are connected very intimately in the sense that, as we talked about, where you destroy the brain, it destroys the ability to access the mind. But I would say that there's something that is disconnected between the self and the physical brain and body for those reasons, NDE being a testable example of that in literature, as well as then, if that's true, then that is now a better explanation for why we have a unity of consciousness, why we have an indivisible self, why we have these different things, and then ultimately free will and moral responsibility.
So what was the next one? Did we cover all 6 of your points, or are we still missing
Well, I think one
two?
thing that we kind of stopped short on was the moral responsibility and how naturalism is a better explanation for that. And you went over some naturalistic theories like Platonism and things like that. And I know that I think it was with Greg Gansel you had this conversation where he even granted the fact that those theories would give you maybe an objective moral good, but it does not give you objective moral obligation. And there seems to be kind of maybe some confusion on what's the difference between a moral good and moral obligation, and why you need an authority, right? And there's a lot of debate on what an authority exactly is. But that's where I would say is a moral obligation of what you should and should not do does require an authority figure that is different than simply just saying this thing is good. So if there is this Platonic view of life where that there is this substance called whatever, this is good substance, I am not morally obligated to follow that good substance. There needs to have a moral obligation and authority behind it in order to create an objective obligation or objective moral duty, not just simply an objective moral value.
Okay, so how so? Because one of the big objections to theism is that even with authority, you still don't get any moral obligation. It doesn't solve any more problems anymore so than just listing an apple as morality, therefore we should follow the apple. Like it's the is-ought problem, essentially.
Yeah. So I think the difference in my mind is, being a teacher is, I think that there would be a difference between saying that doing your homework is is a good thing. It will help you become smarter and advances, blah, 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 versus now me as a teacher saying, you have to do this assignment, is due tomorrow. And so there are commands and moral, there's now an obligation to now follow it.
Wait, that's the part I'm not following, because just the fact that you give a command doesn't mean I'm obligated to follow it.
Well, yeah. So obviously within different views, like with parents or teachers, there's not an obligation in that you are determined where you have to follow it. You still have, from the Christian view, you still have free will to have a choice to ignore it or not. But we recognize then that is where we have this idea of responsibility and punishment, to where when someone does not follow a moral obligation, punishment is involved, to where we have laws that say you should not murder. But when someone goes out and murders someone, we now have the ability to punish them because they have freely chosen to break that moral command.
Oh, I'm still not following, because just the fact that like a God would give a command, do X or don't do X, how does that translate into an obligation? Because the whole point of the is-ought distinction is that no matter what is you put in, God is the ultimate authority, God is the moral standard, God gives these commands, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. None of those can get you to an ought statement. In fact, it's logically impossible, as demonstrated by the fact-value distinction, the is-ought distinction, G.E. Moore's open question argument. All of the biggest problems in moral philosophy demonstrate it's logically impossible to get an ought from an is statement. So even if God is the ultimate authority, even if God says these things, even if God gives you a command, those still don't get you an ought statement, which is one of the biggest problems in moral philosophy. So how do you solve that problem?
Well, I would say that there is an understanding of who we are as free creatures and recognizing the responsibility and reward and punishment. So, for example, I mean, unless we want to kind of change things and say, is it true that I ought to pay my taxes? Like the government says you have to do this. Now I can as a free creature, I can now make I can make the evaluations of saying, okay, I can pay my taxes. I don't want to, but I can pay them and I can continue to live and I'm free and I'm doing X, Y, and Z, or I can not pay them and I go to prison. And so there is an obligation there in the sense that my decision now has there's consequences, there's a weight to my decision, versus if there is no moral command, if there's no moral obligation, no ought given, if you simply just have an is, it is good to do your homework. I have no then responsibility I have to now do homework and turn it in by tomorrow. When a command is now given from a parent or teacher, your decision now has consequences. Ideas have consequences. Bad ideas have victims, and many people say. And now your decisions now have a consequence to it.
Well, I'd say the command is also an is, so it wouldn't change anything. And there's consequentialism has consequences built into its moral theory without any kind of a command giver or an authority to it. But it seems like we can have the consequences without an authority, and it seems like the authority is just another is statement, just like consequentialism. So what is the difference between those two?
So I think that there are consequences in the sense of if I eat a bunch of fat food, I'm going to get fat, right? So there's kind of cause and effect relationship between consequences and some of our decisions. However, I think that there are another category of decisions that we make that do not have that sort of cause and effect relationship necessarily. And so you have examples of people who have murdered, people. And just because someone murders someone else doesn't have necessarily it's illegal, and there is I think, a moral responsibility to follow the rules, like do not murder. But I don't think there's a direct cause and effect relationship, maybe between that and eating fat foods, in the sense that I think one of the big complaints about people, especially a complaint against Christianity, is why do why do good people go to hell, and why do bad people flourish, right? And so you have drug cartel leaders, and you have people who are horribly evil and do terrible things, and they're flourishing. They're rich, they're wealthy, they have a wonderful life. And then you have people that give their life to serve the homeless and the poor and do all these things, and it seems that their life is getting ruined. Their life is going very terribly. And so if we are evaluating something just simply based on how it affects the immediate surrounding of my life, then we have to say, well, it seems to say that it leads to the conclusion that there are these horrible people where their life is flourishing, therefore what they're doing is good, if it's a direct cause and effect relationship versus others. So I think that there are deeper fundamental questions that we have where we are doing things that are considered objectively wrong, and that there's a moral obligation to follow, even though some people do them and get away with it, so to speak.
Well, yeah, in consequentialism, it doesn't say that if you get away with it, it's good. It's just saying that, like, if you damage someone's well-being, then that's bad because the consequences is damage to their well-being. So if you kill someone, even if you get away with it, you've still done a moral wrong just because that person has been harmed. Whether or not you get away with it seems to be irrelevant to morality. The punishment or reward of an action doesn't seem to affect the morality of the action at all. So having a judge to punish you or to give you a reward doesn't really seem to affect whether or not you have any obligation to do anything. It's just seems irrelevant, I think.
Yeah, that's right. I guess I don't see how that's irrelevant, in the sense that I'm trying to think exactly the example that you gave. If you hurt someone, or if it hurts their well-being, right, and that's bad. But what is the moral obligation to where I should not hurt that person?
Because it's bad. That is the obligation. So from my
But
understanding,
there are a lot of people that go around and do hurt people. So who is the authority that is telling me without authority telling me you should not hurt them? Then why not? If I hurt them and if it makes my life better, then yeah, it could be bad for them, but hey, it was good for me. And we kind of get into moral relativism.
well, that's the thing. The authority is what makes it relative. So if hurting someone gets you a reward under your system, well, then it's a good thing to do. So if you have an authority that says, go kill those people and I'll give you a big mansion, then that judge, that authority, is rewarding you for your action, and therefore the morality of the action is contingent on the reward or the punishment, not on the action in of itself. In morality, the morality of the action is contingent on the action in of itself. Like, if you harm a person, it's immoral, regardless of whether or not you're rewarded or punished. And if you help a person, it's moral, regardless of whether or not you're rewarded or punished. So the authority and the judge is irrelevant to the morality of the action, even though it just rewards for doing good or doing bad. It doesn't actually make it moral. The morality is in the action in of itself.
No, I completely agree that murder is wrong in and of itself, independent of if we as the United States voted and legalized murder, it would not become a good thing, right? And that was why morality would be, in my view, and is objectively right or wrong, independent of a culture's perception. I just don't think that where I think the distinction is I don't see that how we, again, get the ought from the is without a moral agent now commanding it, saying, look, we know that murder is wrong, but I am now, as an authority over you, kind of like the teacher, as an authority, I'm now going to say, if you don't follow, there's now going to be punishment for this. And hopefully that moral authority is lining up with the objective moral standard of what is that action, right? So our judge is not saying, I'm going to reward you for going and murdering people and getting people to do bad things. But you do have an authority figure that says, if you go kill people, because murdering people is wrong, if you murder someone, there's going to be punishment for that.
And the added punishment is where you get the obligation, in your view?
I think there's a sense of obligation that then comes from that. Of now, I recognize now, even from a selfish perspective, of that my life now is going to be affected by the decisions that I make. So I think that it's not simply that, but I do think that that is an aspect, even from a very selfish perspective. When maybe I try to get my students to realize is like, dude, even if you only care about yourself, there's still a reason to do what is right because of how it will benefit, in a sense. I don't think that's the reason why we should do what's right, but even if we're purely selfish, that would be a reason.
So imagine if we had two universes, one with a god and one without a god, and in each universes there's one person who kills another person. Is the universe with a god, is it more wrong than the universe without a god?
The act of murdering, it would not necessarily be more wrong. I don't see how you would get an objective, and that's where we get into other theories like you mentioned before, but I don't see how we get an objective wrongness of murder in the universe without God. But I do think that there is an obligation then that does come from personal agency and authority.
Because from my perspective, in my worldview, it's equally wrong regardless. It doesn't change either way. What the God says or does is irrelevant. If the God commands you to kill, it would still be wrong to kill, just because it's involuntary impositions of will are what I define as immorality, my definition of immorality. So in my worldview, even if you have a universe without a God and someone kills someone, it's wrong just because it's wrong to murder. You don't need a God for that. It doesn't seem like the God adds anything. If you take the God away or add one, it doesn't seem to change anything about the situation other than the added reward or punishment after the fact. And so if we're just looking at the action in and of itself, it seems to be moral or immoral without the God, irrelevant of the God.
If we're granting that objective morality can be established independent of a divine being giving moral laws. Right? Yeah. But again, I think that then we have the question of why ought we be moral?
Well, I think it's like saying, why ought I be 6 feet tall? It's because I am 6 feet tall. It's like,
but that's a different. I mean, again, I think this comes back down to free will, right? Of that. My view is that we are free creatures who are making the choice of should I hug the person or should I punch them in the face, and I have a just free will choice to be able to choose between those two. And it's not just, well, I'm determined to hug them and therefore I am going to hug them, or I'm determined to punch them in the face, therefore I am going to punch them in the face. And I think that's where I think we lose something with naturalism, because I think we lose some of that moral responsibility of, well, I was determined to punch you in the face. I had no choice in that because I have no free will. My chemicals made me do it. And so then we have a very different view of even the justice system, of that it's not trying to help someone realize the mistakes that they made and make better choices. It's simply just trying to fix the input new experiences into the system to try to get them to have a different result. And therefore, again, I think that goes against what we experience in the world of human responsibility, of when we praise people for giving up of themselves to serve the poor, and we condemn people for racism. Well, why are we condemning you, saying, hey, you should not have killed that person? Like they had the free will choice to be able to not kill them. And so now I'm going to punish you for killing them. Hey, why did you hold your knee on their neck for so long? Why didn't you choose different? I had no choice in that, right? I was determined to do that. I could not have done otherwise. Where we expect people to be able to make those sort of choices.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's one of the things, one of the more recent advances in the field of neurology, Robert Sapolsky is one of the ones leading this, is the fact that our actions are determined by our brain states. Like, for example, there was a mass murderer, the Texas Tower shooter guy, who had a tumor in his brain, which essentially caused him to become violent. He had no control over it. And if he would remove the tumor, it would have been fine. So he wasn't to blame for the actions. It was literally the physical things in his brain that forced him to do this. There's also similar cases of rapists who did the same thing. They had a brain tumor, and when you remove the brain tumor, their criminal tendencies just went away completely, and then the brain tumor returned, and their criminal tendencies returned, and you remove the brain tumor, they're perfectly fine. So it seems like the progress we're making in the field of neurology shows that is the case. It is really not their fault. It really is the fault of their neurology. And so morality, in the secular sense, isn't describing this obligation about how we should act and how we are responsible ultimately for our actions. It's describing whether or not our predisposition neurology is such that it assists other wills or that it harms other wills. And we're trying to use input to change their neurology to make it so that they are assisting other wills rather than harming other wills. And it really isn't, they don't deserve the punishment that we're giving. We're doing that because we have to, because they're in a state of mind where they're going to hurt other people. They're not blameworthy. It is their biology. And that understanding of neurology seems to be far more compassionate than this idea that you are blameworthy because of this free will thing. It seems like when we actually look at reality, the neurological influences and not being blameworthy and more being a victim of biology is a more compassionate way to look at the world than blaming people for doing actions that they probably didn't have any choice in doing.
Yeah, so I think, man, you made a lot of, I think, really good points there, and I think it would be true that to blame someone for an action that they did not choose to do would be, I don't remember the exact word you used, not be loving or not be compassionate, whatever word it was you used. In the sense, if I blame you for the color of eyes that you have, we look and they go, how, what? But we do realize that there are certain actions that we can blame people for, and we should. And so I think that your example of the tumor in the brain, I think this goes back to our previous conversation on the neuroscience of that there are things that do happen to the physical brain that do affect our decisions that we make. But we recognize that this is a problem, that this person had an issue. And I think that's one reason why when you have, I'm from Colorado and we had, the Aurora theater shooting. And so oftentimes these mass shooters make the appeal that they're crazy. I had some sort of psychological problem with me that caused me to do X, Y, and Z, and therefore I should not be held morally responsible for it. And so we do psychological evaluations, and there are times we recognize, yes, you actually had a legitimate problem that affected your decision abilities in a certain way. To where you didn't realize or didn't think that this was bad. And that's a problem. But then we can't use that then to rule out everything. There are, I think, at times where we recognize that someone is right in the head, where they don't have these sort of psychological problems. And you should have known to lift your knee up sooner. You should have known not to kill that person. You should have known not to do X, Y, and Z, but you did it anyways. We are now going to hold you morally responsible. And so I think that, again, to me, that is one reason why I think dualism better explains, because it does hold that moral responsibility not only possible, but also it is just. Versus I think that you have explained it well, if I'm understanding you rightly, in that if we are judging and condemning people for something that they did not choose or decide, that is unfair. And to me, that is where I see a problem with the naturalistic explanation that the protests that are happening right now are all unfair because we didn't actually choose that. It's all unjust. It's all rather than holding people morally responsible for the decisions that they make and who they hire and how they treat and how they speak to people.
Oh yeah, I would totally agree. I think that we are culpable in some sense. It's called compatibilism, where we have a free will in the sense that we have some spectrum of possibilities that we can choose from through our neurological determination, and that we are responsible for that spectrum of possibilities, even though they are ultimately determined. And so I think that most philosophers would agree that there is some level of culpability to our actions, even if ultimately they are determined. So I definitely agree with you there.
And so that's where I guess I would have the question of what is it that makes us culpable if I am determined? If I did not choose the chemicals that are firing in my brain, that are causing me to think and say and do the things that I do, in what way can you hold me morally responsible for that?
The neurological ability of our brain to make a decision on a certain level of a spectrum. And so that spectrum gives us a certain amount of freedom, even if it's ultimately determined. So we hold each other pragmatically responsible in the sense that humans with a certain predisposed amount of knowledge have the ability to differentiate between certain kinds of categories. And if they differentiate those categories incorrectly or in a way that has been taught against society, we can hold them responsible for doing those things like killing them. Now, we teach that's wrong. We know that people have the intellectual capability to recognize it's wrong given their neurological states. So they should be able to choose not to given our neurological state, even if ultimately they're determined.
Yeah. So I think, man, I think this is where all these ideas are tied together in the sense of, I think this idea of differentiating between different teachings requires conscious free will choices to be able to make an evaluation and choose one versus the other. Versus I would say that maybe it's just, the words we're using, kind of like when we said rocks can do math. It's not that they're actually doing it. They're not actually making choices. They're not thinking. They're just following what the chemicals and the gravity and the physics and the laws of nature are causing them to do. And so I think the moment you then use a word differentiate, I think that's sneaking in free will and consciousness that allows us to be able to evaluate and make a choice that then brings that moral responsibility.
Oh, sort of, because compatibilism is the view that free will is possible even though determinism is true. That's what compatibilism is. So
So are you a compatibilist?
sort of yes, sort of no. I have my own little qualms about compatibilism, but the consensus of philosophers is compatibilism. So I'm going to go with the consensus because they're normally right.
So that's where I would agree with that. I would say, yeah. So at the beginning of the interview, you said free will is impossible with naturalism. And I would say that is the logical conclusion of naturalism, is that free will is impossible. And I agree with you there. The very fact that compatibilism is true, if that's what even the majority of philosophers are saying, I say, awesome. Yes, there is a sense in which we are free. And that free will does point to our moral responsibility. And that free will does point to something outside of our chemicals firing.
Well, the consensus in philosophy is that free will isn't not compatible with determinism. So it's purely determined, but they're just calling the neurological brain states free will, essentially. That's one of the problems I have with compatibilism. So the kind of free will that's impossible is the libertarian kind of free will, where there's like this free will kind of a thing, which is a third option outside of the either it's determined or random state. And so that's why I have issues with compatibilism, but it is purely a naturalistic position of just deterministic stuff. And we're calling some framework of that free will.
Yeah, so we're now just using the word free will to describe something that really is deterministic, and so it doesn't have that libertarian free will in the sense that I'm describing.
Yeah.
Versus, I think that I think that our experience of the world around us, that there's every reason to believe that we have free will, that we have more responsibility and punishment that lines up with that, and we are. I think you could maybe I could say this, that we are terrible human beings if we are holding people morally responsible for actions that they are not choosing freely, then that makes us bad. That makes us wrong for judging them. Versus, I would find it very difficult to argue that position, that we are evil for sending a murderer to prison because he didn't actually choose that, and we are judging someone for doing something they didn't choose. In the same way that you're judging someone for the color of eyes that they have, or the fact that, oh my goodness, you're 5'10", and I'm going to discriminate against you because you're 5'10" versus 6 foot. We see that as inappropriate discrimination. Versus, there are things that we can do to discriminate against people that is just discrimination because it's based on something that is not innate, that they cannot change, but is something that they have changed and they can change.
Yeah, I mean, I'd agree with you. That's why one of my issues with compatibilism. But yeah, so we've been going for about 2 hours. It's been a great conversation. Would you have a little few?
11 o'clock.
Yeah,
that went so fast.
Yeah. Would you have some time for some questions from the audience?
Yeah, shoot.
So Charles and Solo asked, "Can we have knowledge without absolute certainty?"
Yes. I don't think that knowledge requires absolute. If we have to have absolute certainty to have knowledge, and we can't know anything.
Other than I think therefore I am. That one.
Yeah, exactly. Yep, we're in agreement there.
All right. So do you believe that free will is an illusion and that we are controlled by God? Like the I forget Calvinist position.
Yeah, so I don't. I'm not a strict. That is a very, very minority of Calvinists would hold to complete causal determinism. But no, I do not think that free will is an illusion. I think that free will is something real. I do believe that God gives us free will. I would hold to more of the Molinism camp on that idea than strict Calvinism.
Keys Baker asked, "Do you believe
same
God?"
Same thing happens to me when I do Q&A on my channel. Is like some of the names come in, I'm like, I'm sorry.
Yeah. There's some letters in there I don't know. That seems like a backwards U of some kind. It's Swedish. Do you believe that God is the ultimate cause, and what causes choices under free will? Like what causes free will?
So I do believe that God is the ultimate cause, that he is the beginning, the first uncaused cause. What causes our free will? I don't think that there's anything that causes things. I think that there are, again, where I think that there is some agreement that we have is that our previous experiences do, I believe, affect decisions that we make. Like I didn't grow up eating seafood, and so now I think it tastes gross. Right. And so if you give me the choice to eat oysters or chicken, I'm going to choose chicken. And so I think that there are things in our past that do affect us, but I don't think that anything is causing our free will. I do think that we have the ability to choose based on what we have a preference for. I don't know. And then you can say, well, that preference comes from some determining factor, but I don't think that is necessarily the case. I think that we are free in the libertarian sense.
Awesome. So Blaster Master 80 asks, why hasn't any NDEs like the serial number example been replicated under laboratory conditions?
Because I think, so I don't know in what ways they've tried to replicate, but I would say that in a sense that if we're trying to reproduce a non-physical event through physical process, I think that's going to be very difficult. You can't just kill someone and get them to have an out-of-body experience that happens the way that it does. And so I think that it is an event that is difficult to replicate because it's not determined. And I think, again, that kind of leads to something against determinism. I think I saw in a video with, if I remember, with Sam Harris, where he says, if you are deciding which hand you want to raise and you decide to raise your right hand, you had no choice in that, and you would have raised your right hand every single time, right? Because it's like this math equation of all your past experiences add up to you choosing to raise your right hand. And if you rewind that tape, you will raise your right hand 100% of the time. You could not have done otherwise. Versus, I would say that because of free will and our souls being disconnected from the body and not determined, that we can't just replicate it in that same way where you shoot someone and they die, and then you shoot another person and they die. That there is, and so just like our experiences, where I think that if you rewind my past tape of my life, I might have made different choices, and those different choices were affected by whatever thing. And so it's much more difficult to replicate that personal experience. So yesterday I had the experience that when X, Y, and Z happened, I made such and such choice. To then go into a lab and say, let's figure out exactly how that happened. That's much more difficult, if that makes sense.
Yeah, for sure.
I think it's just based, again, on the idea that I have of that things are not determined. And so those not determined choices that we make are more difficult in experiences that take place.
Swedish Face asks, does God give us free will? And if so, how does atheists choose to think?
So I do believe that God created us free. How do atheists choose to think?
Yeah, I think like how do we choose to become atheists, essentially? Like that's in our free will. If God gave us free will.
Well, I think that there's I obviously can't speak to why all atheists are atheists. I think there's a wide range of things. I think one of the videos that got a lot of people upset on my channel, especially got atheists upset, is it was like a reasons why someone might be an atheist. But I think that there are atheists because of intellectual objections, that they are just simply intellectually not convinced of the evidence. And so they say, look, I'm just not convinced, and therefore I don't believe. And that's legitimate. I think that there are people, and I've met them, that are atheists because of an emotional rejection. They have been hurt by the church. They have been hurt by Christians. They have been hurt by certain things. They've had Christianity forced upon them, and therefore they want nothing to do with it. There are also atheists, again, I know personally, that are atheists because they just simply don't want Christianity. I had a student of mine say, if I admit that God exists, then I will have to change my life. And I don't want to change my life. And therefore, I'm just going to say God doesn't exist. Now, I obviously don't know what he actually believed, but he said, I'm an atheist. God doesn't exist. But his reason for saying that was that if I admit God exists, then I would have to stop doing the things I want to do. And that's what he flat out told me. Another one said, if I believe in God, then my life will change and people will look at me differently. And I don't want that to happen. And so that obviously, I'm not saying that's true of all atheists. I just know that there are people who have said to me, I am an atheist. God does not exist. And I say that because if I admit his existence, then I would have to change my life. And so I think that those are volitional reasons. I think they're emotional reasons, but I also think there are intellectual reasons where people are evaluating the evidence and coming to a conclusion that they think makes the most sense on a wide variety of reasons.
Yeah, I think that's fair. That sounds good. Swedish Face asks, if you were never exposed to the Bible, do you think you would still be a Christian? Or if you brought up in a different nation, would you still believe in the Christian God?
Probably not. Obviously, if I never was exposed to the Bible, I don't know how I would be a Christian, because fundamental aspect of Christianity is the death and resurrection of Jesus, which is another piece of evidence that, we didn't talk about. We talked about so much other things, but I think there's good reason to believe in that. But yeah, if I was completely unaware of the Bible and of the message of Jesus, which is contained in it, saying that we are sinners, that we are guilty of our sins, because again, we have made free will choices to do things, to rebel against God, and that there is forgiveness in that, then yeah, I don't see how I would be a Christian.
Croag Nightwolf asks, can you ask him if he believes in the reincarnation, which has just as much evidence as near-death experiences?
I do not believe in reincarnation. I don't, again, I'd have to see what the evidence is of reincarnation. The stories of reincarnation I have read, I don't think that they're evidence-based at all. I think it's very far out there of what these people claim to experience, versus I think the NDEs that I have given are testable that moment, that you can go in that operating room, check the serial number right then and there. So I think that it is a slightly different category.
Okay. Mike Ortiz asks, do you interpret the Bible 100% literal? And if not, how do you determine which parts are literal versus figurative?
Yeah, these are really great questions. So I appreciate it. Thank you guys. No, it's not 100% literal. Because I think it's not meant to be. And so how do we determine it? Well, you have to look at the genre. I think that's one way in which we determine how do we interpret something is we look at the genre, right? We don't interpret poetry that says you are the apple inside of my eye to literally mean that someone has an apple in their eye. And so we recognize when people are, if someone's writing a poem, that's taken and interpreted very different as we would read a history book. And so we look at the poetic literature contained in like the Psalms and Proverbs. We recognize that is very different than the historical narratives that we find in like the Gospels. Then we also see Jesus speaking in parables, speaking using illustrations and metaphors. And so the same way in which we do that today, where you say, this computer that I'm using to stream right now cost me an arm and a leg. Well, you can look at me, see I still have both my arms and both my legs, and know that I'm using just a common phrase to say this was very expensive. Obviously, that would be different if you looked at me and I was a double amputee and I was missing an arm and a leg. Then you'd have some other questions of like, wait a second, what actually happened? And so I think that there are certain phrases that are used that are common phrases to point to a deeper truth. But ultimately, we also look at the genre and look, okay, is this a historical narrative? This is repeating history, like the Old Testament, that is taken more literally versus poetry or apocalyptic literature like Revelation that I don't think is 100% literal all the time because of the type of literature that it is.
Awesome. So Charles and Solo asks, is all knowledge grounded in God kind of like the presuppositionalist position?
So I'm not a presuppositionalist, but I do think that so I'm not a presuppositionalist in my approach, right? As you've seen, I've tried to show evidence for the soul and evidence for a lot of things. But I do think that God as the source of knowledge is the grounding of all things.
All right, cool. If theism is right, but the identity and characteristics of the creator was not Yahweh, would the methods he is using truly be seeking the truth? Is it possible that there is a God, like a deistic kind of a God that isn't Yahweh?
Absolutely. Yeah, so I think if you look at, and this is where we just, again, you can't cover everything in even a 2-hour conversation, but I think if you look at, there's evidence that we have that points to a cause. And then I think there's evidence that we have where I think the moral argument points to a personal moral agent and authority, as we discussed and we disagreed on. And you have someone who's morally good. And so that points to some sort of theistic being. From there, it is the evidence of the resurrection to me that is overwhelmingly convincing of the Christian God rather than an Islamic God or even a Jewish God. The fact that both Islam and Surah 157, I think, or something like that, it says that Jesus did not die on the cross. He only appeared to die. Very clear in Islam, Jesus did not die on the cross. Christianity is clear, Jesus did die on the cross. Judaism would also say that Jesus was not a prophet. Christianity says that he is. And so I think when it comes down to the view of Jesus, where Jesus says that he is God, that he and the Father are one, then he dies, raises from the dead. I think that there are historical arguments that we can make that point to that being a very reasonable conclusion. That would then lead to the Christian God of Yahweh rather than some other theistic being that simply is just outside of space and time.
Yep, great. That makes sense to me. Would he know that God exists if no one ever told him that? Isn't it proof that he got all of the knowledge from the Bible and that wouldn't have the knowledge if he didn't read the Bible? Like, is it possible to have knowledge of God without the Bible?
I do think so. And so what Christianity would teach is that there is a general revelation where God has provided knowledge of himself, that his divine attributes, this is in Romans chapter 1, his divine attributes and his character are made clear in the things that he has made. And so an example of that would be you can have knowledge of an author by the fact that there is a mere existence of a book. And a book is something that we know, are authors, or a painting points to a painter. And so the fact that we have a creation would point to a creator. And then Romans chapter 2 would talk about how that we can know right and wrong because the moral law has been written in our hearts, where we have this understanding of objective morality inside of us, even though we haven't maybe been exposed to certain things. And so I think that that would be evidenced by the fact that there are atheists, one of which I know, like Hugh Ross was on, you interviewed him, and his story is that even while an atheist, not a Christian, not a believer, never been exposed to Christianity or read a Bible, started looking at the scientific evidence for cosmology and started pointing there has to be some sort of beginner or beginning. And there are other testimonies from missionaries where they go to some tribe that has never been reached and they begin to present Jesus and they go, oh, yeah, we know about that guy. I also think that there are examples of this, and there's many stories coming out of the Islamic world where Muslims are having dreams of Jesus, where God is revealing himself to them. So I think that if you have, if you're assuming Christianity to be true, which I guess this would be, of how would I figure out who God is apart from the Bible? Well, God reveals himself through dreams, through visions, through nature, through the moral law written on our hearts. And so we can have at least an understanding of a creator, of a moral lawgiver, apart from reading the Bible itself. The Bible, I think, is the best way that God has revealed himself to us, but it's not the only way, general revelation being another way.
Awesome. So Cookies Baker asks, are choices under free will an exemption to the everything that begins to exist has a cause for its existence?
I'm not sure I understand, because I would say that as I try to argue that God made a choice that then caused the universe. So I don't know if,
I think he's asking, like, since our choices have, or do our choices have a cause? Like us, not necessarily God. Since we have free will, we make free choices. Are those choices caused, like determined by something else, or are they free from the everything that has a cause must have a reason kind of?
So yeah, that would be everything that begins to exist has a cause. And so I would say, well, that choice I just made, I guess, began to exist. Well, what, caused that? And I would say that's my mind freely thinking of that thing. I don't know if that makes sense or if that answers the question, but yeah.
Yeah, cool. How does the soul interact with the brain? Cosmic QQ asks.
Yeah, so I think the soul, I had something written down here really quick so I can find something a little bit more specific. Where was it? But I would say that the soul, oh, I know where it is. Hold on. Sorry about that. Let's see. The soul, so the soul would contain the consciousness, would animate the body, and let's see. What was the question here? One more time. What's the difference between the soul and the brain?
Or how does the soul interact with the brain? So it's the classical objection to dualism is that the interaction problem. How does the non-physical stuff interact with the physical stuff?
Yeah. Okay. So I would say, I don't know exactly how something functions, but I like the example. Greg Kokel uses the example. He was asked, how to explain the soul to like a child, and the best thing he could think of is that the soul is like a hand inside of a glove. And so the very fact that the glove is moving, that there's something inside of it moving it. And so because we know that gloves do not move by themselves, if the glove is moving, that there's a hand. Now you can take that further and say, if we wore gloves 100% of the time for all of human history, maybe we start to doubt that there's a hand inside of it. We just think the gloves move. So I would say that I don't know exactly how the soul interacts with the brain, but the fact that we are doing functions that I think are different than what the brain can do, and I've tried to show a few of those here. I think that then points to the fact that there is a soul performing those functions. So I think that there are certain things, and I think the same would be true of science. There's certain things that we know are happening, and we are trying to figure out how exactly that's happening. But just because I haven't figured that out yet, doesn't mean that it takes it away from it.
Sure. So does he think that everyone needs a smile? Does he think that people who come to Christianity for emotional reasons rather than intellectual or revelatory reasons?
Do I think that those people
is a good thing?
Is a good thing. Well, no, in a sense of, I obviously think it's a good thing for people to come to Christianity for whatever reasons they come to Christianity. However, I don't think that they should stay there, right? So if we emotionally persuade someone through fear or something to come to Christianity, hey, well, you made a good choice. So I think it's the same thing of like, if I can persuade you to eat healthy or to do something that's good for you, I may have used maybe some wrong reasons to do it, and that's not okay. But the fact that you made a good choice is still good. Now, hopefully then after making the choice, you take a step back and you learn better reasons why you should continue to make that choice. And so I think that is how I would approach that of that there are many ways in which we come to Christianity. That's a good thing. We made a good decision. But once we are Christians, we should take that step back and say, okay, now why should I remain a Christian? And then I think that's hopefully where the intellectual and other reasons come into it.
Cool. So do you think everything was meant to happen B? Swedish Face asks.
Everything was meant to happen B.
Yeah, like did God determine everything beforehand? Again, kind of like a Calvinist question, or is there do our free will can diverge? Can we do things God doesn't know about?
We can't do things God doesn't know about. I believe that God in his omniscience knows all things that can happen. I frequently have conversations about this on Twitter with certain individuals where I don't think that then means that we are determined. I don't think that there is I don't think that knowledge causally determines things to take place. I think there's a difference there where we can have knowledge that if I let go of my pen, it will drop, but the knowledge that it will drop does not cause it to drop, right? There's a difference. So I think that God does know all things, that he does have sort of a divine plan in what will happen. He has told us the end of the story and what will take place, but I do think that we have free will choices to act within that plan. And so I guess an illustration that I use to describe this to my students, and again, this will kind of make Calvinists upset or certain individuals, but where I can have my birthday this weekend and I'm going to plan for you to be there. And then I give you the choice, do you want to come to my birthday or not? And then you can make your free will choice to attend my birthday or not attend. That's not necessarily going to disrupt my plan because I'm going to have my birthday anyways. It's just either it's going to happen with you there or without you there. And that's where you have a choice in it. Now, I can even take that maybe a step further to where when I got married, there were people I invited to my wedding that I knew would not come because of circumstances that I knew about. I knew that they would not come. And so I invited them. I wanted them to be there, but I knew that they would respond no. And so it's not necessarily affecting my plan. In fact, I'm actually planning for them not to be there, even though I'm still inviting them and giving them the choice. Now, obviously, I don't have all knowledge in the fact that if something changed and they went, yes, I'm coming. Oh, cool. Now I have to change my plan a little bit to incorporate. But just because I know what someone will do, I don't think takes away their free will decision on what they choose to do.
Cool. So if you went back in time and asked Jesus, how did humans come into existence? How do you think Jesus would answer? I think it's an evolution question.
How did humans come into existence?
Yeah.
So I hold to the creation model. I'm not a young Earth creationist. I do not believe everything is 6,000 years old. I do believe in progressive creationism, but in that I still believe that humans are a special creation of God in their current form towards the end of the creation period. So I think that's what Jesus would say. And I think that that's what Jesus did say in Matthew chapter 19, where he says, have you not remembered from the beginning, God created them male and female, that God, even Jesus is pointing to the creation of humans, male and female at the beginning.
Cool. Iron Charioteer asked, which came first, cause or effect?
I guess the cause, in a sense, that God is the first cause, and then he chose to create the universe, and then the effect took place.
Yeah, I guess that makes sense.
I feel like half of these answers, it's like you have a lot of thoughts to share on those as well, and you're doing your best to stay silent. And I feel like others is like maybe there's some Christians that are like, wait, what? Because I maybe am not understanding it perfectly. But hey, I'm trying.
Bring up open theism and Greg Boyle, like, hey, yeah, he's in the theory of free will, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I'm definitely not an open theist.
Yeah, so I think that's good. We've been going for about 20 minutes. That was great Q&A. Thanks for being willing to ask these guys questions or answer these guys questions. Thanks again for coming on. This was a great conversation. I really enjoyed having you on.
Man, the time flew by. I really appreciate this. And again, I was interested when you reached out. Wasn't quite sure exactly how it happened, knowing that I'm not a philosopher, theologian, or a scholar in these areas. But I think that we still had a very engaging conversation, and it was a fun way for me to spend my morning. And so I appreciate you having me on. Maybe I'll have you on in the future, and we'll discuss some of these issues that came up that we weren't quite sure about, like the NDEs or something like that.
Yeah, for sure. I'll definitely look into those two cases you brought up about the quarter and the serial number. Definitely look into those.
Yeah. Okay.
Awesome. Great. Thanks again for coming on. I really enjoyed talking to you. I'll talk to you later.
Thank you so much. Have a good one.
Bye.
Bye.
This episode of the TJump podcast is brought to you by you. If you value this content, please consider supporting the channel.